When the blacks and greens went to war in the year 129-130, it had been over 80 years since a dragon had fought another dragon. And of course, I'm referring to the literal dragons, not Targaryens. The hard-won lessons learned during the days of the Freehold and Aegon's conquest and the subsequent wars involving Maegor the Cruel had apparently been forgotten during the long peace that followed those events. In this episode, we highlight that lost wisdom ourselves. Hey, just because they forgot it doesn't mean we need to. We'll showcase the destructive power of dragons throughout known history and a little bit in the not-so-known history areas, which is a power the Targaryens took for granted to the peril of all Westeros during the Dance of the Dragons. Arguably a few other times too, but the dance was the last big mistake they were able to make in that regard, because obviously afterwards, well, they couldn't really lose dragons they no longer had. So we'll make sense of how the Valyrian dragon riders kept from making that same mistake, how they avoided destroying each other, as well as how their methods of conquest reveal some of the very internal struggles that could have led to that destruction, but they were able to manage things in a way that didn't do that for thousands of years, and yet, well, the blacks and greens didn't do whatever the old Valyrian dragon riders were able to do. So we're going to examine how that lack of unity still managed to avoid complete destruction, unlike the blacks and greens. Then we'll discuss how the Targaryens had a unique opportunity when the Doom made them the lone dragon rider family in the world, and how the Iron Throne itself might be a key reason they blew that massive advantage. So from Valyria all the way up till right before the Dance of the Dragons, we've got all that and more on this episode of History of Westeros podcast. Hello and welcome, everybody. As of this recording, we are getting very close to House of the Dragon Season 2. This is a book-centric episode, but of course, Fire and Blood, especially Season 1 of House of the Dragon, lines up pretty well with a lot of the events of the books. So a lot of times when we discuss one, it really does discuss the other. And we're excited for that. During the season, since it's coming close, I'll let you know, House of the Dragon streams are going to be at 6 Eastern on Mondays and 3 Eastern on Saturdays. The Saturday episodes will be spoilery. We'll be looking towards the next episodes, laying out everything we know. The Monday episodes will not be. We'll be discussing what happened and only what we know from trailers and things like that. We'll also do some episodes on Wednesdays at 7 Eastern. Some of those will be live, some of them won't be, and the topics will be TBD. It's going to partly be a play-by-ear based on what things happen during the season kind of deal.
The episodes on Monday might be spoilery, depending on how good my predictions are.
That's true. The last frontier of Sean's unsullieddom is the Dance of the Dragons and the few events that occur afterwards in Fire and Blood. So we're going to do it like that, just as we did last year. It's been a lot of fun, and we'll keep it rolling that way. After every episode, whether it's a book-centric episode or a TV-centric episode, you'll find the video up on YouTube, the original live stream. You'll be able to find an edited version up on Spotify, and anywhere you find podcasts, you'll be able to find an audio-only version. If you go to Patreon, though, and sign up to be a supporter of History of Westeros, you get those ad-free. So that's a nice little bonus, as well as getting bonus episodes and access to scripts and voting on polls, other fun stuff we offer if you join us on Patreon. So, hey, Sean, we're black and green today. We've got our colors lined up. You've got The Office. I've got Dragonstone. It's about the same, really. The Office is located on Dragonstone. Scranton is the Westerosi word for Dragonstone. So, you know.
Is the path up to Dragonstone Abbey Road?
Yeah, I guess it must be.
To clarify, this is a mashup shirt.
Yeah, you're right.
My all-time top band, The Beatles, and my all-time top show, The Office. And coincidentally, this shirt is green.
Yeah. Also, shout out to our good friend Nina. Her blog is over at goodqueenalley.tumblr.com. That's one Y in alley. And the latest post over there is right up her alley. Her alley. Hey, I didn't even mean to make that pun, but it works pretty well. She got a question. Do you see a similarity between Marjorie Tyrell being put on trial and the trial itself of the daughters-in-law of King Philip the Fair of France in the Accursed Kings. Now, Nina loves questions about the Accursed Kings. It is most likely her favorite parallel to discuss to A Song of Ice and Fire, and two of her favorite novels of all time, or series of all time. And yeah, she loves that discussion. So check it out. She's basically, the short answer is yes. She does see a similarity between those two. But if you want the details, you'll have to go to goodqueenally.tumblr.com, as I do on a regular basis. If you have questions about this episode or any other, go to westroshistory@gmail.com. or send us an email to that address, rather, westroshistory@gmail.com. Or if you want to, and you're live here with us, just post a question in the comments box, and there's a decent chance that Shay will grab it, and we will answer it and or discuss it. Also, at the end of this episode, I will give you some suggestions for more episodes that relate to the topics in this one, so as to facilitate further immersion in the world of Westeros. Also will be the answer to this trivia question, which is... we're told the largest ever army assembled in Westeros was at the Field of Fire. That was 55,000 soldiers on one side. That's just the one side's army. What was the largest single-size army ever assembled in Essos? Yes, let me tell you, it's larger than 55,000 soldiers. And the answer, as usual, is in this episode. Pay close attention. You'll know the answer if you don't already.
You know, before we dive into this, I wanted to preface it with a thought that was dominating my mind prepping for this.
Right on.
It reminds me a lot, this topic reminds me a lot of the movie War Games with Matthew Broderick in the 80s.
Oh, yeah, I love that movie.
Yeah, and, the idea is that, there's a, computer technology is assisting, the powers that be, the Pentagon or whatever, in the management of the nuclear warheads. And the computer is kind of becoming sentient. And it just doesn't understand the idea that everyone loses in nuclear war, And Matthew Broderick's like a young kid. He's like hacked into the computer, and the Pentagon's, who is this kid? And it's all this intrigue unravels. But eventually the computer kind of learns, that you just can't win. And the only way to win is not to play the game, And that thought process was dominating my mind a lot throughout the course of thinking about, basically this episode, we're going to talk about like how destructive dragons can be and how the Targaryens over time use them destructively against opponents. But in A Dance of Dragons, they use them against each other. And so like, they just can't, there's not a way to win in that scenario,
Yeah, that's a great analogy, because not only does it use the phrase game, not only war games, and we talk about if you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die, especially if you play with dragons. And George himself has used that nuclear comparison many times, and it is appropriate because of that analogy, because no one wins if nukes are deployed. So yeah, peace is always the goal, right, in any society, but sometimes peace has reigned so long that the horrors of war are forgotten, and that those memories are a big part of what keeps you from making that mistake again. Those lessons have to be you don't have to repeat the lessons, but you have to remember the lessons in order to not repeat them. But if you don't, then you kind of inevitably do repeat them.
Not to nitpick your point too much, but I would say that peace should be a goal.
Yeah, right? It isn't always. You're right.
Sometimes the ruler's goal is to maintain their power, whatever. And also, peace is a goal, but maybe even the main goal. But liberty and justice are also goals.
Sure.
You could, at some point, you might be willing to fight, to go to war or whatever for the sake of liberty and justice. But when you go to war with dragons and nuclear weapons, like, no one has liberty or justice when everyone's dead, right?
Yeah. It's terrible. It's so bad. Yeah. So the reason it's another reason it's such a great comparison to nuclear weapons is that it's a deterrent. No one wants to go into nuclear war. I mean, no, hopefully no one wants to. Like, really, like, you shouldn't want to, but. Which is why it's effective. Neither side uses them. They both know, okay, let's not fight because, well, both sides can utterly annihilate the other. It's not the best system, but if people understand it, it does keep either side from actually using them. And the dragons should work similarly, but...
Yeah, if we do fight, we'll fight via some proxy, right? We'll fight over some other foreign territory or some political control. Maybe we'll even send some troops on foot in, but we're not going to really go to war.
Yeah, exactly.
/ nuclear weapons, right?
Which is what happens in the real world. There's lots of wars going on right now that involve nuclear powers that they're not stupid enough to deploy their nukes. They might threaten it. They might rattle that saber. But to date, we haven't had nuclear war. We've had nuclear bombs drop, but it wasn't nuclear war. So
don't jinx it, Aziz.
Yeah, right.
Somewhere.
So the Valyrians held this power for thousands of years, and no other world power did. It's sort of the equivalent of one nuclear state existing in the world and none others. And yes, the Valyrians learned to only use that power for the most part. I mean, obviously, there's lots of parts of their history we don't know, but clearly they didn't self-destruct because they kept going for thousands of years until, well, the Doom did destroy them, but that wasn't necessarily self-destruction. Anyway, it's an interesting comparison to the real world again because it's humanity that makes it more dangerous. Nuclear power is a real thing. It happens naturally in the sun and other stars, right? Just like if dragons were real, they wouldn't kill people nearly as often as when they're ridden and controlled by humans. Like, we've seen the behavior of wild dragons in this world, both under Daenerys and during these eras. And yes, they do occasionally kill a person, but they don't like torch entire armies or castles or anything like that. That's with humans behind the wheel. Same with nuclear power. So when the Doom came along, yeah, they dodged that fate of being annihilated with everybody else. They had just enough dragons to perhaps restart the whole population, with them in control of it all. Instead of 40 families with them at the bottom, they could dictate this new world of draconic power. But interestingly, they just kind of sat on it for 100 years. The number of dragons didn't increase. And they, well, it stayed that way. So it shows like the willpower of one individual, or at least a few individuals, is required to expand beyond that. But maybe they were smarter than Aegon, right? Maybe they did the right thing. Things didn't start going downhill for the Targaryens until they had the Iron Throne. So that's going to be a big topic today. When Rhoynar the Exile brought his family over from Valyria, 12 years ahead of the Doom, yeah, they brought the dragons, they brought their saddles, they brought dragon keepers, they brought knowledge of dragons needing to live in volcanoes, they knew how to hatch eggs, they knew all these things. But they didn't bring with them probably the most important lesson, the wisdom of not pitting dragon versus dragon. Or perhaps they did and just forgot it later. At some point, they seem to have forgotten how important that was. Now, they never fully forgot it. Even in this latest season, we have quotes during the trailers of how bad an idea it is to do this. But that's just usually one or two intelligent individuals standing against, a tidal wave of forgetfulness or stupidity or naivete, whatever terms you want to use. Most of the people are ready to go to war, whereas only a few voices of wisdom are like, no, don't do that. Like Sean said, the two nuclear states launching against each other, it's most likely the end of both, and not to mention some of their neighbors, perhaps. So the Blacks and Greens forgot, if they ever knew, if they were ever taught in the first place, what the dragons were capable of. They know the power you feel when you're sitting in the saddle, flying high above. It was the first scene we saw in the show. In fact, with Rhaenyra flying over, besides that quick shot of, the Great Council. But they never learned not to turn that against each other. The lessons why. Some of it's obvious, right? But if you really get into why, it looks like madness. It's the only way they could lose their top spot, not just in Westeros, but in the world. So this was the lesson that kept the Freehold from destroying itself for thousands of years. They figured it out somehow, that not to destroy each other. Somehow they put laws, customs, restrictions. Who knows? We're gonna theorize about some of those things. But it's a war, and all of that ended. Thousands of years of dragons and dragon riders. It all ended because of a war that might never have happened if they had just remembered the lessons of the past. And of course, history of Westeros, we're gonna emphasize the lessons of the past as much as we can. Super chat from Zach Remley says, "History of Westeros, let's go! I love you guys." Well, thank you. We love you too, and we love that we're getting into another peak of attention here with a season coming upon us, and lots of excitement building up. So we've got lots of content coming for y'all.
By the way, once again, I don't mean to mince words, but I want to point out it's not just like forgetting the lessons. Like, you have to teach them. You have to pass them on. Like this new generation of Targaryen kids, it's not like they knew it and forgot it. No one taught it to them, as far as we could tell.
Or they didn't teach them enough. They didn't emphasize it. Like, they kind of know on some level. It's just kind of obvious on some level, but it's not obvious enough. It's not like why it's so important.
Paramount or foundational to their mentalities or philosophies or objectives or whatever. They seem to have relatively temporary or / emotional motivations.
Yeah.
That are about to have world-changing consequences that they're not weighing against the knowledge of the world-changing consequences.
Yeah,
you know?
It's like a strategy. You should say, okay, like when two people go to war, when two people are going to fight, oftentimes the one who's willing, like you said, Sean, you brought this up before, the first person who really realizes it's a fight, the person who's willing to go the farthest, that can be an advantage. This is why it's kind of natural that it went this way, and why it's a lesson that needs to be taught and enforced. Because if you just go the general like attitude towards war and fighting, it will end in self-destruction because the weapons of war are that powerful. If it's just swords and spears and arrows, well, you probably won't just wipe everybody. Both sides won't wipe each other out. They might severely handicap each other or damage each other, but it won't be like outright genocide of both sides, right? Because they just don't have the technology doesn't exist except with this. This is the one thing that is above the board. So yeah, Valyria had all that. Yeah, go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, you just made me a new thought popped in my head. It's something else that I think we've talked about before is the idea that throughout history, like in the real world, throughout history, there's been this sort of limitation on how much damage you could do in war or whatever, right? Like originally, you like punch someone or hit them with a rock or maybe throw a rock, shoot a bow and arrow, but that's still just one person hurting one person at a relatively limited range. But then eventually you had maybe like catapults, bows and arrows were an advancement over like punching, and then catapults maybe could hurt several people at once from a significant distance. And eventually you have, artillery and machine guns, and it starts to become a little easier for one person to do a lot of damage to a lot of people at a greater distance. And you get to the most extreme with the nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
But it took thousands of years for human society to kind of make that progression. But in Martin's world, it's been that way for thousands of years.
The technological advantage had already existed. It was a natural thing. Yeah, it's totally different, or maybe even supernatural, you want to call it, but it wasn't technology, which is a great point. Because, like in human history, we've only had machine guns for, 100, 120 years, something like that. Not super
maybe
long.
Even a little 150, but original rudimentary.
A fraction of the length of human history is the point, right? Like this is relatively new, but so that's a great point that it's existed much longer. So yeah, Valyria had wealth and soldiers as well, and that's most of what their conquest involved. It wasn't, the dragons didn't play a role in, or played a small role in a lot of their conquests, in part because, it wasn't necessary, in other part because the 40 dragon rider families were mostly concerned with internal power struggles, and usually the expansion, if one dragon rider family is gaining power outside of the city by engaging in conquest, I don't know that the other dragon rider families wants to support that, because then that makes that number 3 dragon rider family jump to number 1, and number 1 and 2 don't want that to happen. So they're a lot of times going to sabotage each other's efforts outside of the city, which frees up the more regular conquests to take place. So, but another point is that a lot of nations will just surrender. Like if the modern U.S. military marches up to, I don't know, almost any country, really, the U.S. is really powerful. Let's say they just march to like Barbados, something really small that doesn't even really have a navy or an army. They'd be like, yes, we surrender. Like, of course, apart from world diplomatic consequences for the U.S., let's just pretend that's not a thing. Yes, of course, they're just like, yeah, we can't win. Of course we surrender. That's what a lot of nations are going to do, because like, they have dragons. Like, we can't fight that. It's better to bend the knee and live under this yoke than it is to die. Now, that's not going to be true for everybody, because some people are going to be enslaved. And they're just like, no, I would rather fight to the death because it's slavery. Like, yes, I would rather fight a dragon than be enslaved. But that depends on,
you might have to face the overpowering force. Might get the surrender in a moment, but then face subversion, guerrilla warfare, terrorism, whatever down the road.
Yeah.
And a small group of people. It depends on what's at stake. If we say like, we're going to take over your country and we're going to tax you 10%. Like, okay, otherwise you destroy us, sure. But if you say we're going to take over your country and enslave every man, woman, and child, like, you might as well fight to the death over that, right?
Absolutely.
So it depends on what's at stake,
Yeah, and with Valyria, it's a little of both, because they will enslave a lot of people, but they won't enslave everybody, because they do want to keep it a functioning nation that they can tax and draw repeated wealth from, rather than just one shot and destroy the whole society and loot the whole thing. They're not the Dothraki. That's what the Dothraki would do, for example. So, but
it's also kind of a dark thought, but is a strong chance that they're just going to enslave people that were already enslaved, just going to be our slaves instead of your slaves? You know what I mean?
In some cases, yes, like with the Ghiscari, but not with the Rhoynar or the Andals. Yeah. So yeah, you're right. It depends. But it couldn't have always been this way. And what I mean about Valyria, they weren't always just outward. They had to start off learning from their mistakes like any other nation would. I doubt very much the very first Valyrians to tame dragons immediately attuned a deeply held prohibition against fighting one another on Dragonback, right? Like a lot of animals are stupid enough to do that in the real world. Like there's a lot of animals like snakes will kill each other. Like they'll wrap around each other like a poisonous snake versus a constrictor. Like you've probably seen videos of this out there. They're certainly available if you have that kind of curiosity, like a python strangling or a boa constrictor strangling another poisonous snake with a poisonous snake bites the boa and they both die. Like this sort of thing happens in the real world. Animals kill each other because they're just so, one single-minded or what have you. Humans don't have that excuse for the most part. They should be able to learn from their mistakes. But yeah, you kind of wonder, like wild dragons, like again, bringing them up, they don't do a whole lot of damage to humanity. They'll occasionally steal a sheep here and there. But yeah, it might ironically be humans that cause them to behave even more stupidly. They make them more likely to kill each other. They make them more likely to drive them into violence. So records of wars in Valyria, meaning Valyria's wars against itself, we don't have that, but it had to have happened. I mean, it's like, what nation doesn't have some infighting when it's new or even when it's not new? Now, we don't know whether what that entailed, but it's easy to imagine some dragon rider families going to war against each other, causing great devastation. So many nations have this in the real world, have this history where they just keep fighting and fighting and fighting and destroying each other over and over. And maybe eventually they learn not to do that. And sometimes those lessons last for a long time. But of course, those lessons never involve the kind of level of technology that the dragons bring to the table, which is just blowing everything away in a manner that wouldn't be possible otherwise. If the dragon lords of long ago, of Valyria, had torn each other apart, as much as the blacks and greens are about to, dragons might have just gone extinct a lot sooner, right? Like, they clearly didn't go quite that far. Maybe there were cases where a couple of dragon rider families went to war against each other and the others sat back and reaped the rewards of not shredding each other, and just eventually they just learned. It's just stupid to do this. Somehow they got over that. I imagine this early phase of self-destruction that the surviving elites formed a spoken or unspoken pact not to use dragons against each other. Kind of like how, so far, the real world has, again, knock on wood, it's only one side has nuked others, but there's never been a back and forth exchange of nukes. Let's hope it stays that way. But I'm guessing it didn't stay that way in Old Valyria. It was too early. The technology wasn't evolved over time. Like you said, it was just there for the taking. One day people learned to fly dragons, and how long before they started turning that against each other? Probably not long, right? But we're talking thousands of years that they had of this, of figuring it out, of trial and error, of societal evolution, of saying, okay, maybe this time we won't turn the dragons on each other. Maybe this time we've learned our lesson. Maybe it took them just dozens of iterations, but finally it stuck. And they're like, all right, we don't do this to each other. We've learned our lesson over hundreds, if not thousands of years of destroying each other. Let's finally not do that. There's similar prohibitions in other societies. I'm sure there's real world ones too, but we can just stick to Westeros or Essos really for that. Like, the Ironborn aren't supposed to fight other Ironborn. That's a religious prohibition. They obviously do it anyway, but it's there and it partly works. It certainly stopped them. It certainly has prevented some violence, just not all of it.
I wish they would go ahead and take each other out.
It's a similar thing, though. They're much more successful as a society when they don't fight each other. It does make sense, even for a country that's just rife with violence. It makes sense that they would evolve to mostly inflict that on others. Like, obviously, like, if I'm with you, Sean, it would be better if they just only inflicted it on themselves and didn't go out slaving and torturing and pillaging and all that other stuff. The concept of guest right.
If you had a righteous, just, enlightened culture, and they went to war amongst themselves, that'd be kind of disappointing. And they would be unlikely to go to war against other people. But when you have a country who's based on slavery and destruction, and like, please do that just to yourselves and not other people.
Yeah. So guest right is a similar one. Like, the idea that you shouldn't, that it's this huge societal and cultural prohibition against killing someone that gives you shelter. That had to evolve from something. Like, otherwise, like, society can't function if people are just afraid to let people in. You know, like, everyone's an enemy. Everyone might potentially kill me and steal my house. You know, like, no society is going to get off the ground if people are doing that. So you understand this might be a thing because that was a thing. There's a big prohibition against it because it was a real problem. Right? Like, it wouldn't prohibit something that isn't an issue. Let me give you an example, real world example. In the US of A, we have drunk driving laws. Every state has drunk driving laws. There's countries in this world that don't. It might surprise you if you live in the US to hear that, because it's like, really? Isn't that a problem? People driving drunk? Not really. Yeah. For some reason, Americans are just worse with drunk driving. We're just more violent. We cause more damage with it.
We have more driving too. There are more people with cars and roads and higher speed limits.
But there's countries like Thailand, like Bangkok is one of the most driving cities in the world, and they don't have drunk driving laws. It's just not a problem. They don't need to, you know? Maybe that'll change one day, hopefully not. But yeah, it's just not a thing. So you look at these things and you must think it must have been a thing. It must, to prohibit it and to have a serious cultural prohibition again, it must have been a problem. Like, no spilling blood at Vaes Dothrak, right? Now, they get around that with strangling and molten gold, but they do care about the rule enough to work around it and rather just to ignore it, right? It's stuck.
At some point, they established that rule for a reason. And they might find some ways around the letter of the law, but it seems like they generally follow the spirit of the law.
And you can see why it would make sense. You have a warlike culture that, like, they have a central meeting place. You got to have rules against fighting. If you're going to have all these, like, people whose whole worldview is all about violence and fighting, and that's the best thing you can do. Well, you got to have a place where that doesn't happen, or else you'll just destroy your own capital. The Dothraki culture would have collapsed. It's already not that strong as a civilization, but yeah.
Even when you're already at war and you're determined to wipe out your enemies, there's still this agreement that we're not going to kill the envoys.
Yeah,
right? And when someone
Peace
does,
banners
it's like this awful, terrible thing that no one can believe happened when someone kills an envoy, you know?
So let's have a quick quote here that sort of frames this a little bit more for the Valyrians. Here's what we're told briefly. Quote.
At its apex, Valyria was the greatest city in the known world, the center of civilization. Within its shining walls, 20 rival houses vied for power and glory in court and council, rising and falling in an endless, subtle, oft savage struggle for dominance.
This is why we're so certain there was infighting. I mean, this is power we're talking about. World grand power on an epic scale. So it's not hard to guess people wanted that, sought it, tried to claim it, tried to take it, went all out. But it's not quite the Game of Thrones, is it? Because there's no throne. It's a major point we'll keep coming back to. If you create an office that dominates everyone, then people will fight for that office. The Valyrians, that was a smart, from their perspective, cultural innovation not to have that office in the first place. Don't have a king, don't have an emperor, then you don't all fight each other for it, because that is who would fight. The dragon rider families would fight each other for that, and they would use their dragons because it's absolute power. Better to not have that office at all. Then they don't have to fight each other. Then it enables them to continue to look outward rather than fighting each other. And it says that. It says subtle, oft savage, endless struggle for dominance, but not destructive. They're not raining fire down on each other's castles or mansions, whatever buildings they had in Valyria. We always come back to the lack of knowledge about some of these specifics, but could it really have lasted? Could they have risen to be the most powerful nation in the world if they were constantly just raining fire on each other? I really don't think so, because dragons are just so destructive, right? And we'll see examples where there is 100 or even 300 dragons functioning in the same military operation. A rare thing, but it did happen, and it wouldn't have if they were constantly fighting each other, because these dragons would just be killing each other, right? Like, dragons are offensive weapons. They're not defensive. They don't carry shields. Their scales are pretty tough, but they have long necks, and yeah, they're just vulnerable. They have bellies that are big, and they're...
I don't think their scales are as tough as their teeth, right?
No, they're not. Not except very unusual cases only, or exceptions, yeah.
Their scales might be tougher than archers' arrows, that's why they're effective. But when they turn on each other, they can... And it's hard for one dragon to kill another dragon without also endangering itself of being killed. Like, sometimes the size difference can help, and maybe with numbers things could be different. We don't have a lot of knowledge of like dog fights of multiple dragons.
Yeah, if three smaller ones taking on one, could they, like, maybe if with the proper training and tactics, that might be doable, but that's the kind of thing we don't see. We don't know. There might be written about. There might be books about that. More on that later. So not only was it likely a cultural evolution, but probably a societal evolution. It might have even had laws. They might have been like, look, if any of the 40 families turns its dragon fire on another, they're some sort of prohibition, some sort of sanction. Maybe the other houses are allowed to go to war against them if they break that rule. Like, as a last resort, though, I think still you would use force, soldiers, poison, even sorcery, maybe. But the dragons, I think that's the absolute last resort.
I wonder if they had wards, like Theon and the Starks or whatever. I wonder if they had something like that.
That's not unlikely. It's such a common real world way of keeping peace.
Because it would not only be in a similar scenario, it would not only be like a deterrent, like they'll kill my son if I turn against them, but also having the children grow up with other families makes them less likely to want to go to war with the other family.
Yeah,
they have a bond with them or whatever.
Exactly. It's the same concept that applies to so many places. So kind of like how when Aerys broke the feudal contract, he started just murdering great lords and calling for their heads. They're like, well, we better team up on this guy or he's coming for us next. This is how the political system in Dune is set up. The Landsraad. If the emperor ever tries to attack one of the great houses, the other great houses have signed an agreement to attack the emperor so that he won't do that. And that's basically the setup to the whole thing. They
so clearly the emperor needs to have an even more powerful army.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So the bottom line should be for the Valyrians to preserve their special, unique advantage. Don't squander it and wind up like every other race on the planet, dragonless. You have dragons. Don't screw that up. Obviously, we don't know exactly how that evolved, but it did. Somehow, over time, because these families would have destroyed each other, just like the Blacks and the Greens. It took the Doom. It took something like the Doom to finally accomplish that, to end the world, to remove their authority from most of the world. It took this hyper-geological event that is potentially somewhat supernatural in either trigger or the event itself. Who knows? But that's not our focus today. Let's talk a little more about the nature of dragons. Like we talked about a lot of this already. Let's just kind of focus on it for a minute. They're far more destructive than they are defensive. Just think about flame and tooth and talon and how destructive that are versus wings. The dragon's wings are incredibly vulnerable. We mentioned necks, but wings are also extremely vulnerable. And like scorpion bolts and other large missile weapons, those can do pretty serious damage to a dragon if you hit them in the right spot, like in an eye or maybe in the neck. But it's really hard to aim and hit that properly, and it might not even do that much. It might just annoy them. For the most part, though, human weapons aren't equipped to deal with the wings. Like even a scorpion bolt through a wing would just put a hole in it. It still would work. Like we've seen Vhagar flying around with some holes in her wings. She gets around fine, and it might heal up a little bit. But another dragon biting onto another dragon's wing, that's pretty quick. You're going to tear through that like Kleenex or something. That's just weak. So I figure the Valyrians had figured some of this out too. Strategies to deal with anti-dragon, anti-aircraft missile weapons like scorpions and things like that. Like Aegon the First attacked Harrenhal at night. That might have been an existing Valyrian military strategy for using dragons in a way that keeps the dragon safe. There's two basic strategies for using a dragon. One is just don't use it. Use it only as an intimidation and fear. Two, like we said, if you're going to have a dragon fight another dragon, make sure you have a huge size advantage. Otherwise, don't do it. It's a bad idea. Again, the long neck. Your neck is... Every creature needs its neck. It's one of the most vulnerable things. And dragons have those hugely long necks, which, again, humans can't take much advantage of that, but another dragon can. One dragon could bite one dragon's neck while the other dragon bites that dragon's neck. That's how long and gangly they are. They could just
Sounds
neck each
kinky.
other. What's that?
Sounds kinky.
Yeah. So... there again, it's like some grim Ouroboros. One dragon biting one while the other bites it. They both die. Like Vhagar killed Arax without much difficulty. But Arax probably would have gotten away if he was really trying. But, dragons aren't smart. They're aggressive. And maybe with some clever maneuvering, Arax couldn't have killed Vhagar. But Arax could have killed Aemond. Killed the rider. And like we said, like we theorized earlier, maybe 3. Yeah, like you said, Sean, you have a note here. What if there were 3 Araxes and they were all...
Yeah, 3 Arax might have been able to, it still would have been risky, and one of them might end up dying. But if 2, if one can, come from one side and one from the other, and Vhagar commits to one, and one comes from behind, Vhagar chases one while the other 2 come around from behind or underneath. There's ways with coordination, especially if they were trained in this. And that's the type of thing I wonder if there's knowledge of that, books that exist or existed at some point that got lost. But I was thinking a lot about in terms of I want to say modern warfare, but I'm honestly thinking more about World War II, where you'd have bombers that were kind of big and slow and couldn't defend themselves very well, but they could do a lot of damage. But they would be escorted by little fighters that were quick and maneuverable. And the combination of those was just almost unstoppable.
It's the same for ships, right? You have big old ships with little ships. Yeah.
The little fighters would beat the bombers. So that is a little bit different than the dragon scenario. But but we don't have that. We don't have a scenario where we see 3 or 4 little dragons swarming one big dragon. But it would be interesting, as far as I know. Maybe that happens in dance and I just don't know it. But
in the Valyrian Dragon Wars, we can assume in all those thousands of years it had to have happened, and it seems likely that they had tactics and books written about that. Now, these books, it's not the same as we brought up. The cultural preservation, the ideas like the Dothraki prohibition and guest right. Those are society wide. The difference here is that these is just the dragon writers. Maybe they don't write everything down. Maybe some of this is family secrets that they don't want other families to learn. Maybe some of it is not quite the level of the Song of Ice and Fire Dream that's passed down, but something like that, something you keep within the family rather than something you write books about and share with everyone because it's something that you all learn from everyone. This might be a little more like corporate secrets, the recipe to Coke. They're not sharing that with other soda companies,
Some things might be hard to write down too. Some things are maybe kind of subtle, subtle little things that a pilot or a race car driver or whatever does. It might be hard to describe or write or teach. All sorts of high level athletes probably have little nuanced things that they figure out, and they might be able to explain to some other elite athlete on their level, this, or you could see her in slow motion film, but it'd be hard to write a book or even for someone to read it to understand how to do what they're writing about,
Exactly. Let's talk about some specifics. We got a lot of different conflicts to cover here. Let's start with the Ghiscari Wars, because that was the first big superpower that the Valyrians went up against. 5,000 years ago, the Ghiscari were the greatest power in the world, we're told, and they had been that for some time, and they weren't excited about giving up that title to someone else because they had held it for so long, even though that power had an insurmountable advantage. But I don't think the Ghiscari properly came to terms with the fact that the Valyrians had an insurmountable advantage. The Valyrians took on this Ghiscari, but really it was the other way around. The Ghiscari started all 5 of the Ghiscari Valyrian Wars, which sounds kind of stupid, doesn't it? Now maybe the Valyrians
of who wrote the history.
Yeah, maybe they didn't, but I don't know that the Valyrians were shy about being conquerors, so I'm not sure they would have concealed that. On the other hand, it's why they weren't trying to look nice. They were horrible slaving authoritative monsters in a sense. I don't know that they were concerned with looking good. Maybe they were. Maybe they were. I know that maybe they were when those books were written. I don't know, because this would have been a long time ago.
Or
Either way,
to some extent, Rome had slaves and was conquering people, but they still wanted to paint the Gauls or the barbarians were barbarians. They didn't talk about how we starved out these people that had a system of laws and produced wine. We destroyed these barbarians in combat.
Like they needed to go. That's how they phrase that. So the Valyrians took on. So it's interesting to think about how the Valyrians took on the Ghiscari. Maybe they got them to draw first blood, but it's what they wanted. They wanted the showdown, potentially. And this reminds me of the conquest. Aegon the Conqueror went for the big dog first. He went straight for Harren the Black in order to perhaps encourage / intimidate the rest of Westeros into saying, well, he took out the biggest guy, we should surrender to him. He's like, look, or at least to intimidate them. And it kind of worked. Not entirely, maybe not as well as it could have, but he didn't have to Balerianize everyone. Several people did surrender. I mean, the lords of Westeros are pretty stubborn and prideful too. They had been in charge for thousands of years as well, at least in their corners of Westeros. So, but at least the kings, this is where I think there's a big difference. So the kings of Westeros, for the most part, were at least willing to take on the risk themselves. They were willing to lead their armies and face the dangers themselves, which, I do respect that more than what I think the Ghiscaris did, which is mostly fight a long series of proxy wars, that's why I think they were so willing to get into these wars, is because they were fighting in territory in between them. Like, Shay's going to pull up a map here. We've got the region between Slaver's Bay and the the Valyrian Freehold. And there's a lot of territory there. Mantaris, Borash, these kind of neutral zone, what would have been a neutral zone perhaps at some point in the past. So if the leadership of the go ahead.
I just want to say real quick that we describe it as like this neutral zone, but the fact is innocent people lived there and got killed. That's which is why you're saying that you have less respect for them to like just sacrifice all these people in some distant land you don't know anything about.
Exactly.
Going out there yourself. Like, I'd rather there just not be any war, but
it's like sports. They hear whether their team won or lost, and then they lose money because they had bet on their team. And in this sense, betting on the team means investing in the invasion army or what have you. But they only lose money. Like from way far away in Old Geese, which is farther away than even Meereen and Astapor and Yunkai would have been from Valyria. To them, it's just these ultra rich people sending their citizen and slave soldiers to war and losing and being like, dang, well, let's try again. Like to them, it is just a dang. Like maybe they're maybe a little more mad than that, but that's all it is. They're just mad. They lost. They don't suffer any real consequences. Their armies obviously suffer massive consequences. Back then, the Valyrians didn't have slave soldiers. Maybe that's part of why the Ghiscari were more willing to start wars, because they're throwing their slave soldiers away, whereas the Valyrians are, yes, they're not losing dragons, but they are losing citizens. They are losing, resources. So it's still something. You have to wonder, like, when did the dragons come into this, and how often, and how readily, and in what number? Because if you feel like if they just had this concerted effort to send all the dragons against the Ghiscari, there wouldn't have been 5 wars. There would have been maybe just the one. The Ghiscari were particularly outclassed in certain theaters of war. They fought over Sithorios. They fought over the Basilisk Isles. That must have been particularly bad for the Ghiscari. Like, how do you win naval versus naval when one side has dragons? Like, ships are the most vulnerable thing. They're way more vulnerable than armies. Armies can scatter, hide in caves. There's nowhere to hide a ship, even pretty much at anchor. It can't hide. Like, there's 1 or 2 exceptions, like Lannisport or Castle Rock has a protected harbor with inside the caves. I don't know of any other spot on all the Planetos where ships can hide from dragons.
Even at Castle Rock, you might be able to hide a few ships from a couple dragons. But
I don't know, but even about a whole fleet,
dragons hovering around, yeah.
It's hopeless basically. So why did they keep fighting? This is why I think they kept fighting. One, the detachment from consequences is a big one. Another is pride. They just can't accept that they're no longer the biggest power in the world, and they have so much money. They've been on top for so long. They don't want to be the one generation of Ghiscari that fumbled 5,000 years of being at the top. That's a quite, for people who are concerned with their legacy, that's a big deal. But also, I don't think the Valyrians ever fully concentrated all their firepower at the Ghiscari because of their constant infighting. They don't want any one family to gain any more power than another. They're like the crabs in a bucket, pulling each other back down. No one can crawl out of the bucket. It's a weird analogy for ultra-rich, hyper-powerful people, but it works to serve that none of them want any others to succeed. They all want to keep them at this level so that they can't dominate. Like, I don't want this crab to be above me, or he'll use his crab powers on me from above where he has leverage, Let's all drag each other down. And it did finally end when they did gang up, and they did send a whole bunch of dragons to Old Gis and to torch the entire city, and that was the end of it. So once they finally got their act together and said, hey, let's end this for good, they did it. But why did it take them 5 different wars to finally do that? One, there's a couple reasons. One, they may have hoped on long-term conquest and didn't want to destroy them. 2, but mostly I think it was political willpower. They just the Valyrians weren't united on that goal. They didn't want 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 families to get all the credit and all the wealth. And so they easier to oppose it than to support it and get the short end of the stick from the spoils.
There are pros and cons to having power split up. That is a pro when you have a good king or queen, a good central authority, and they want to do a good thing, they can just do the good thing, and it just gets done.
Yeah.
But if they want to do a bad thing, they can just do the bad thing and it gets done too. So
yes.
If you split the authority up between, Congress and executive branch or 40 families or whatever, then it's difficult if someone wants to do a bad thing to get it done. It's hard to get everyone on board to work together to do it. But also, if you want to do a good thing, ostensibly destroying the Ghiscari is a good thing. It's hard to get everyone to agree. Eventually they did, but it took a lot, right? It took multiple wars. Eventually everyone was like, okay, fine, I guess we have to...
Let's just end this problem once and for all. There's probably like a big push for it. There may have been a push for it after the 3rd war, and then after the 4th, and finally, see, it's just going to keep happening. Let's just end this once and for all. Which is how there's so many comparisons between the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage. That is eventually what happened. There was a push within the Roman upper class to just wipe Carthage out. The 3rd Punic War was just an aggressive, let's kill them. It didn't start over any real conflict. It was just, they're powerful. They've regained their strength. Let's destroy them because we're afraid of them. And also we'll get to loot their city and take everything.
Yeah. Side note. Yeah.
Yeah. Which
I wonder if another factor, a couple of things. I wonder if maybe the Valyrians, the dragons weren't as numerous yet. Maybe their power, the control over the dragons was still new enough. That might also explain why the Ghiscari thought they could beat them. That they hadn't really,
or they were aware of their political system and how it kept them hamstrung from uniting. And they were like, well, this will we'll never have to face more than a few at a time because blah, blah, blah. But yeah, I like that theory.
I wonder if another reason too is if maybe this is when the Valyrians started their slave trade. And that's why the Ghiscari wanted to stop them. They're like, hey, that's our business.
Yeah.
They didn't have slaves at that time.
Point,
How long after this time before they did have slaves? I wonder if that's what was prompting this, is that they were starting to get into that business, and the Ghiscari were like, no.
So bringing it back again to this Carthage and Rome example, when Carthage was on the verge of defeating the Romans in the 2nd Punic War under Hannibal, Carthage stopped supporting him. Their home city, the capital, was like, uh-oh. Because they were worried that he would use this grand, enormous victory to make his family king, to dominate all the Carthaginians. So it would be like one Dragon Rider family was about to defeat the Ghiscari by themselves. And the others were like, no, we can't let this happen. And they ganged up to stop that from happening. And that's why there was a 3rd and 4th and 5th war, potentially, because...
He still almost did it, even when
he did still almost
right?
did it. Yes, he did.
Close,
yeah, you're right, and it lasted a long time. It was like a multi-decade war. Also, Carthage didn't have a king, and neither did the Ghiscari. So these things are all somewhat fitting. But you'll see, you think about Rome. Rome also kind of freaked out and did some crazy things whenever they were afraid of someone naming themselves king or dictator for life, in the case of Julius Caesar. And they were probably usually right about those people's intents, like Julius Caesar. They were right about that. So perhaps the 40 families, the individual families, should less be thought of as, elite families. I mean, that's true, but maybe it's good to think of them as individual nuclear states or pirate kings or organized crime. cartels, some version of that. It has elements of all those things. They definitely have the nuclear power, like a nuclear state. They have the grand wealth and kind of agreement not to fight each other, sort of like pirate kings and organized crime. But they rarely work together. And but when they do, it's really bad for whoever their foe is, because they're awfully effective in those short windows when they do work together. But underneath all this is a reluctance to use dragons. They were reluctant to use them not just against each other, but against military targets as well, because they don't want to risk them. They don't want any chance of your dragon dying. It's a huge loss. You lose that permanent intimidation, that permanent status, that permanent elite level within society. It's probably not easy to get a new dragon, even within a dragon rider family, especially if you have a particularly big dragon or something like that.
Yeah, and imagine how much you've invested in the dragon over time too.
Oh God, yeah.
Freaking food, and a lot of training, and maybe even there's I don't know what to say, like a bond, like a pet, like you really care about your dog or your cat.
Yeah,
the dragon
sure.
Probably has a personality, a character that you care about,
Absolutely. So for the most part, they want conquest, not destruction. But of course, in the case of the Ghiscari capital, they're like, well, let's destroy it. There are other exceptions. Let's talk about the Rhoynar. This is one of the juicier parts of all the history, is one with some parallels we've never explored before. We have, of course, explored it in other ways. Our episode Mother Rhoynar, focusing more on the Rhoynish side, is one we made quite a while ago, and it's still very relevant. There was the wars with the Rhoynar were characterized by an early lack of interest by either side in a large-scale war. These were like little city-state affairs where dragons weren't even involved. The Rhoynar were powerful and older than, in some ways, than the Ghiscari. Not older, but maybe they were older, but not on an empire, not an imperial level. They didn't have an empire. They were not as foolish as the Ghiscari to pick fights with the Valyrians, at least not right away, or at least especially not 5 fights, 5 wars. But they did actually eventually do that. It took a little more. Maybe it was something like what the Ghiscari decided to go to war over. But yeah, it was the Rhoynar. They were like, hey, go ahead and settle along the Rhoynar like we do. Have some cities, just coexist with us. Eventually, that didn't go so well. It worked well for a while, and the Valyrians started, like, religious problems happen. The Valyrians would kill some turtles, and the Rhoynar worshiped those turtles, and there's probably other issues, but they started to regret that their parents and grandparents had allowed the Valyrians to settle there. I think this is another forgotten lesson. I think their parents and grandparents realized that this is the best deal they can get. Yes, they're going to be annoying, even violent neighbors, but it's better than them turning their dragons against us. It was the lesser of two evils. But those grandparents and parents didn't have to live day to day alongside the Valyrians. It wasn't exactly they weren't faced with the same consequences. So
they might not have known how close the two evils were to each other.
Yes,
right?
Yeah. Like, and especially if there's maybe there's some slaving here and there, and the Rhoynar don't like that. A lot of just cultural friction, we'll say, if not worse. And maybe because the Valyrians were so reticent to use their dragons along the Rhoynar got a little complacent with that. Maybe the same thing happened with the Ghiscari. They're like, well, they hardly ever use those dragons. Maybe they don't even have as many as they say they do. Maybe they don't have the control over them as they claim. Maybe it is all just intimidation. Turns out, no, they can marshal a lot of dragons at once and do an enormous amount of damage. But until you see that happen, you don't know it's possible. Maybe even the Valyrians aren't sure that they can organize that level of effort, that level of unity. So Valyria didn't just come dragons blazing right away. They weren't like, let's send a huge invasion. In fact, it looks like they hardly ever did that. It looked like it looks like it was 1 or 2 or 3 of the families going on an endeavor to conquer some territory and using that wealth to support their internal struggles within the capital. Like the point of conquest outside of Valyria was to fuel the internal struggles that still managed to keep dragons out of it, right? So when the wars did start along the Rhoynar, it was the Rhoynar that started them. They had enough, I guess, and it was more than 5 wars. So the forbearance of their earlier generations to make them look not as dumb as the Ghiscari, that fell off eventually, and they, for whatever reason, they thought they could win, or they just had to. I don't know. But even after numerous conflicts, the dragons were still not a big part of it. It's really interesting. Here's a quote.
This series of conflicts reached a bloody climax 1,000 years ago in the Second Spice War, when 3 Valyrian dragonlords joined with their kin and cousins in Volantis to overwhelm, sack, and destroy Sar Hoy, the great Rhoynar port city upon the Summer Sea. The warriors of Sar Hoy were slaughtered savagely, their children carried off into slavery, and their proud pink city put to the torch. Afterward, the Volantines sowed the smoking ruins with salt so that Sar Hoy might never rise again.
So 3 dragon lords accomplished this. Remember, there were 2 port cities at the end of the Rhoyne. One on the west bank, that was Sar Hoy, and then the east bank is Volantis. And of course, Sar Hoy had been there longer, but the 2 cities developed a rivalry, and eventually this was the great end of it. So a series of bloody climaxes, a series of bloody conflicts that ended in this. And even at the climax, there were only 3 dragon lords involved. All these hundreds of years of war, of back and forth conflicts, lots of different events, lots of different battles. But the dragons were pretty much not involved until this climax, and it was still only 3. So you can see why, like, a lot of these conflicts would have just continued on a rather normal, conventional military level. And it's like, yeah, well, and that might be why a lot of the Rhoynar got to thinking that's how it would be. Like, yeah, the dragons just aren't a part of this. For some reason, the dragon lords, they got their own things to worry about. This is the Volantines. They're descendants of the Valyrians. They're Valyrian by ethnicity, but none of them are dragon lords. They don't have that kind of power. They're not coming for us with that. So it's very different. But this wasn't just an ending. The destruction of the city put the other cities on notice. They were like, uh-oh, what's to stop them from destroying us one by one? It's that same whole, we have to band together. Same as the Landsrod in Dune, same as the Great Houses against Aerys, same as any countless other examples like this, where if we don't band together, they're going to destroy us one on one. They're going to divide and conquer. Was that true? We don't know, but it was certainly the perception. And the greatest leader of the Rhoynar at the time, Garren the Great, got them all on board with this idea, this attitude. 3, they had sorcerer princes too. The Rhoynar had magic, so it's not quite the same. The Ghiscari didn't. So in some levels, maybe they're not being as foolish. Maybe they did have a chance. Maybe, I don't know. They didn't win, but maybe it wasn't as all foolish as it seemed.
Did the Rhoynar have a king? Did they have a capital city?
No.
Because that's another thing I was thinking about, that there's plenty, I'm sure, but one parallel I was thinking about, like, Russia was at war with Afghanistan for 10-ish years.
Yeah.
Never knew used any nuclear weapons. And maybe partly because, well, what good would it have done? They blow up one village in Afghanistan with a nucler weapon.
There aren't central targets, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that's got to be one factor. This is a little bit of a tangent, but I wonder if another factor is, like, the dragon lords don't want to be mass murderers. Maybe they just know that when they go in with the dragon, burning people alive, like, they have to live with that themselves. Like, I don't, that's got to be a factor for someone launching a nuclear weapon too, So
certainly. And we don't hear about dragons dying during the Ghiscari Wars. Maybe they did. Maybe there were a few lucky shots, which might be part of what the Ghiscari looked at, said, hey, look, we can kill a dragon here and there. Let's keep going. So yes, this is something of like what happened with Garren the Great and his army. It's going to be familiar. It began with something that will remind you all of the Field of Fire. Quote,
"The largest army that Essos had ever seen soon assembled at Croyane under the command of Prince Garren. According to Beldekar, it was 250,000 strong. From the headwaters of the Rhoyne down to her many mouths, every man of fighting age took up sword and shield and made his way to the festival city to join this great campaign. So long as the army remained beside Mother Rhoyne, the prince declared, they need not fear the dragons of Valyria. Their own water wizards would protect them against the fires of the Freehold."
It was sort of true there, and they weren't fools to believe it might be true, but they had never put it to the test against a large number of dragons. They had put it against the test against a small number of dragons, and it worked pretty well. So, yeah, there's reasons to think they had some advantages that the Valyrians might have actually feared. And again, individual dragon rider, like if they were like drones, soldiers, they would take some losses. But these are individual elite members of the top families. They all really value their lives. They aren't doing this for some cause. They're doing it for personal gain or to maintain their status. It's not the same as when Aegon invaded Westeros, where you have a lot of kings that have pride in their dynasties. It's dissimilar for a lot of reasons, but very much unlike the army at the Field of Fire, which formed for one battle and then lost. This largest army of Essos did quite a lot. It destroyed many lesser cities, towns, and villages. It overwhelmed Valisar and Selhoris, large cities. But no dragons were involved in those battles. However, the next battle did. Quote, this is interesting.
At Volontaris, Garin found himself facing 100,000 foes, 100 war elephants, and 3 dragonlords. Here, too, he prevailed, though at great cost. Thousands burned, but thousands more sheltered in the shallows of the river, whilst their wizards raised enormous waterspouts against the foe's dragons. Rhoynish archers brought down 2 of the dragons, whilst the third fled wounded.
Very interesting. So these techniques, it shows techniques that aren't available to any other nation that we're aware of. The water spouts, that's really neat, and I hope we get to see that on screen one day in the far-flung future, because that sounds really cool. So those sound more defensive and defensive than anything, like putting out fires and stopping the flames before they get going. I'm not sure that it would kill a dragon. Maybe it would. Maybe it would knock one out of the sky and the concussion.
Or knock its rider off. It might
knock the rider off, yeah.
Enough.
If a rider falls off, they would drown. Now, riders are apparently attached to their saddles with chains, so they might not be able to knock one from the saddle so easily. You might not know that, just seeing Daenerys fly without a saddle, but yeah. But no, we've seen other dragons. Yeah, saddles that's more of a wartime thing. I think if you're just flying around on your own without any danger, you might not bother with the chains. I wonder if we'll see that in House of the Dragon this year. Now, but the archers taking down dragons is very interesting. Very interesting. Like, that doesn't seem possible in Westeros. Like, they've tried so many times. Like, do they have special bows, special arrows? Maybe. It's not stated what wounded the third dragon. It may have been more arrows, but maybe it was the water spouts or some other beans.
It might just be sheer numbers.
Yeah.
So 250,000 people in the army, right?
Yeah.
And the army might have been assembled knowing it was going to face dragons. Can you imagine 50,000 archers, right?
Yeah, right. Which they would be prepared, maybe, because they know what they're facing.
And consider also, when you have those huge numbers, the likelihood of having a prodigy increases too, right? Like
some Angai the archer or some
Yeah, like I'm imagining the 50,000 at the Field of Fire. There might have only been 5,000 archers among them.
Yeah.
5 of them might have been outstanding archers. But even the outstanding archer has to be in the right spot at the right moment. But a 250,000 army that might have had a higher ratio of archers, they might have had as many archers as all the soldiers in the Field of Fire.
It's true.
And if only 1 in 100 of them is an outstanding prodigy, then you might have had 5,000 master archers with the support of these water spouts and all this other stuff going on.
Yeah, who knows? Like what we talked about, several small dragons going against a big one, and how they might have had tactics for that. They might have had tactics for this, like use the water wizards in concert with the arrows in some method to slow the dragon down in order to get a bunch of good shots at it, something like that. But
like shoot the water spout, the archers know the dragon's going to move a certain direction to avoid that, and they preemptively shoot the arrows at that spot.
That's a good idea.
1,000 arrows coming all at once. And
our imaginations can probably come up with a lot of fun examples that might be pretty close to the truth here. It's easy to see how there's a lot of possibilities. But isn't it interesting and telling that all this happened? You get this massive army, apparently the largest army ever seen in Essos, and the Valyrians, for the most part, didn't do anything. Like the Freehold, like the Dragon Riders, like the 40 families, like 3 Dragon Riders were there. That's it. Out of all we got 40 Dragon Rider families, and there's only 3 Dragon Lords there. Out of that's just 3 members of Maybe just one family. Maybe there were 3 guys, one from each family. But I'm guessing that might have just been one family with ties to Volantis, to the elite in Volantis. They had interests there that they were trying to protect. All this time, the other Dragon Lords weren't interested. But for some reason, like, look, the dragons were beaten. That's bad for everyone. The spell of the dragons can't be defeated has been broken. Now the world knows that dragons can be beaten. When they know who did it, we got to answer that. We got to prove decisively that they just got lucky, that we come strong, and we'll show them that it won't be close. So something got them going. The loss of status, the idea that maybe dragons weren't going to be feared as much, something got them going, and this made them act. If the Rhoynar were winning, the reputation that they rested on, their laurels of, hey, no one's going to fight us because we can't be beaten, that isn't true anymore. Well, they're going to have to prove that, hey, actually, this was just a one-off. We're going to go crush them. And here's how they did that. Quote,
"The Volantines retreated back behind their black walls and appealed to the Freehold for help. And the dragons came. Not 3, as Prince Garin had faced at Voluntaris, but 300 or more, if the tales that have come down to us can be believed. Against their fires, the Rhoynar could not stand. Tens of thousands burned, whilst others rushed into the river, hoping that the embrace of Mother Rhoyne would offer them protection against Dragonflame, only to drown in their mother's embrace. Some chroniclers insist that the fires burned so hot that the very waters of the river boiled and turned to steam."
That's not that hard to believe with 300. That's not that hard to believe with 300 dragons burning the water. That's a lot of dragons. That's a lot of heat, and dragon fire is so intense. Maybe just a little bit. Like, the river is awfully large. Like, we're not talking about the whole thing boiling. You can't even see the other shore from one side, but still, I could see that happening on the shallows or what have you.
Also, that idea you can't see the shore from one side to the other, the whole river isn't like that, just sections of the river.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So we don't know exactly where this battle was. And if the dragons did concentrate their fire, upriver to wherever anyway, yeah, I could see that being like just terribly, painfully tragic.
So they weren't united to make this conquest. They were united when something went wrong, right? 300 dragons didn't come to subjugate the Rhoynar. 300 dragons came because there had been a loss, because they lost, like the supremacy of Draconic authority was being challenged. That's how I interpret this. I don't think these, like, it's kind of irrelevant to whether they had been provoked. Like, who started it doesn't matter. It's all about, we have to be seen as the dominant people in the world. And if there's ever a challenge to that, we have to answer it as a group. This is the one time they show unity that we've seen here, is when that supremacy is challenged. It isn't because there's gain to be had. Like, there was that was clear prior to this, but you could also see why they didn't want to get involved too. You got guys getting shot down by arrows. Like, well, they don't want to go near around that. That's not a risk they want to take. But if 300 dragons come at once, it's pretty hard. They have the safety in numbers argument. It's like, well, they can't concentrate their fire on one out of all 300 of these. Like, that's also enough to make people run. You see that coming, you don't stand your ground. You're like, 300 dragons. Like, you might not be able to count that high, but you would be just, the sky would be black with dragons, and that's terrifying. You might not have thought that was possible. How high would your
count have to get before you decided it didn't matter if it's 247 or 292?
Picture that. Like, all these wars have gone on for a while, months if not years, and there's just nothing like this has ever happened. It's all of a sudden 300 dragons. Like, they'd never seen more than like 3 at a time. This must have seemed impossible. It was like, wow, they really are capable of a lot more than we thought. That's what I was saying. Like, if they had known that this was possible, they might have surrendered long ago. They might not. They might have still fought. People are stupid. People are stubborn. People are proud. But they didn't know what they were truly faced against. Oh, yeah. That's right.
I was thinking about that, by the way. 300, that's like 7 or 8 dragons per house. I wonder how many of them might have been smaller dragons just to beef the numbers up. I wonder how many of them were truly trained or...
It's a great question. You don't see the smaller dragons being deployed for the same reason. They're more vulnerable. Like, why risk it? It's one thing to risk a huge dragon, a small dragon. That's just hold off a little longer, and then it is a huge dragon, and then it's not as risky.
It really feels like you could have gotten your point across with 50 dragons, with 30 dragons. Like you could do 3 times, 10 times more, and I think you wouldn't have risked all of your small dragons.
Which is why I think it's very telling. Like, I think it's political. They really wanted to show the world what happens. Like, this is what we're capable of. Like, it's very demonstrative.
Yeah, I wonder how many, even if the number is exaggerated a little and it was only 200, that's still 5 dragons per house, right?
Yeah.
And how many dragons does each house have? Like, I wonder if that might have been 95% of all the dragons,
It might have been a really huge number. You wonder, like, it was like a draft, almost like a dragon draft. Like, oh yeah, everybody's got to go. Unless your dragon is under 5 years old or your rider is still a teenager, like, everyone goes. If you're under 16, you can stay, but that's it. Everyone else has to go. Like basically a draft for the elite only, which is kind of a strange thing. Like, only the elite are drafted because no one else has the dragons. So
another interesting dynamic. We've talked about this idea a little bit before too. Those 300 dragons can all show up and burn stuff down and kill that army, but then they can't like take over a city. They couldn't take over the Rhoynar,
right?
The dragons can't like land,
settle,
and control the city and collect taxes or farm they fly back home and eat more sheep or whatever. So it shows that the potential that the Valyrians had to go destroy something, but that's still different from going to conquer something.
Yeah, and you're right. Like, that's the thing. Remember, again, I've had to use Dune as an example. The ability to destroy something is controlling it. That's what they relied on. That's why I say they're a lot like Mafia, because they don't control everything, but they can get what they want by threatening to destroy it, which they're capable of, or at least destroying part of it or killing you, the person standing in their way. Same with the Dragonlords. They didn't care about the Rhoynar, but when they did, they destroyed it. They were absolute with it. They're like, you couldn't get them interested. They didn't care. But when they finally did care, oh my gosh, it was terrifying and destructive, and the whole world saw it, which is what they wanted. They wanted the whole world to know and remember and leave and bow down to them when when the time came. Yeah. Let's have a quick break, and then we come back. We have another example of a huge number of dragons all at once, the only other example we have, and then we'll move on to Westeros in more modern times. Well, my friends, we are once again getting close to House of Dragon season, as I've said. It's a good time to ratchet up your interest in this world, and hopefully that involves supporting some of the creators in this space, like potentially us. We rarely have sponsors. We occasionally have a sponsor here and there. It's, maybe a couple times a year. We're right on that cusp as a show where we sometimes are barely able to get the attention of sponsors, but sometimes not quite. So we do rely on you all more than anything. The biggest part of our income comes from crowdsourcing, from Patreon mostly. So if you want to join that group, if you listen to us regularly, if you think we're doing enough to warrant that, then head on over to historyofwesteros.com. Or other, well, you can actually, you can do that. Historyofwesteros.com has the link to Patreon, but you can go directly there by going to patreon.com/historyofwesteros. And our website has a lot of other ways to support us. Besides Patreon, you can peruse our links. A lot of those have affiliate kickbacks to us. You can buy our shirts. We have a great new House of the Dragon shirt, or Dance of the Dragon shirt that Ashea designed that we have a new ad coming for soon. You get to see a great picture of it and all that. It's designed like a tour shirt. Ashea did a great job of that. So there's a lot of ways to support us. And also, I do stream most Fridays, a game in the world of Westeros. We're currently playing House Tarly. We have a Lady Tarly right now. It's usually a lord, but we have a capable, very dangerous woman in charge right now. She's not to be trifled with. She's very willing to murder and speak her mind, and that's a lot of fun to play. So check that out Fridays at 6. If you are so inclined, it's a lot of fun. Hang out with fellow Westorians. Let's talk about the Andals. Andals are a little interesting because they were distinctly the third big culture that the Dragonlords took on, or that the Valyrians took on. And I say that it is important to distinguish that because a lot of times it was just the nation of Valyria with the Dragonlords not directly involved, or just their agents being involved. Because again, reluctance to use dragons because losing the dragon means losing your power and authority. So these conflicts were after the Rhoynar and Ghiscari Wars because, well, the Andals were on the other side of the Rhoynar. They were west of it, and so the Rhoynar was like a buffer state in between. But they were a much lower tech state. So they were in big trouble when the Rhoynar fell. They didn't have sorcery or this vast wealth and large empire of the Ghiscari, and those didn't work anyway. Both those nations lost. So the Andals were in big trouble because all they had was their Faith of the Seven, which is potent as a religion. There are a lot of very strong belief in that. But it's, as far as we know, it was non-supernatural. So they didn't really have any sort of edge there or nothing to stand against dragons, really.
I think faith in the dragons outweighs faith in the seven, I'm going to say.
Yeah, it seems like one was definitely real. The other, I don't know. So...
was there ever any conflict or tension that we know of between the Andals and the Rhoynar?
Not of substance. I think they lived in peace for the most part. The thing is, the Rhoynar stuck to the river. They didn't expand, so that enabled them to live in peace with a lot of people, and they became powerful and rich and civilized, so people didn't really want to mess with them. It's like, yeah, they're powerful. They're a good neighbor, and they're powerful. It's just like there's a lot of deterrent, and they're friendly. So, like, yeah, why do that? I'm sure there were some zealots amongst the Andals who hated the worship of turtles and... but, and other things. But what were they going to do about it? They were the weaker nation by far. Now, the one thing that helped the Andals avoid some of the Valyrian hegemony and authority and depredations was that they're pretty far away. And the farther you get away from the capital, given so much power is concentrated in the capital, the less interest the Dragonlords will take in you. The Andals certainly weren't a threat, and the distance was kind of annoying. But Valyria did have that endless appetite for slaves and wealth, so they definitely went there and took slaves and wealth. How many dragons actually came to Andalos, though? I'm skeptical it wasn't that many. If your goal is to take slaves, I don't know that dragons are that helpful in that regard. Like, dragons will intimidate and kill, but again, if you're going to be taken captive and enslaved, you might fight to the death. And if a dragon is very capable of killing you, that they haven't accomplished their goal. If they've killed you, they want to take you as a slave, right? So, I don't know, it's tricky. They might have had some standard shock and awe type strategy. Again, come back to Aegon, and maybe this is something he learned from his own family's history, from Valyrian lore. Go in, blast a central target or two, smash their biggest castle, burn their largest castle, kill their biggest king, like they did with the Planky Town. They burned the Planky Town at the start of their conflict with Dorne, their war with Dorne. Aegon burns Harrenhal right off the gate, right off the bat, right? That's the first thing he does. So this is one attempt. In one way, you dishearten your foe. You tell them there's no point in fighting, and you get the noble class to give up, because the nobles give up. They have an expectation of being able to keep some of their power as long as they're feeding a lot of that wealth to Valyria. Now we're subject to you. We'll keep our people in line and give you some of that wealth. Because if you don't do that, then the people at the bottom, who are the ones that are going to be faced with slavery, are just going to fight to the death because they're faced with slavery. So you subjugate the nobles, who then in turn subjugate their own people, or who have already subjugated their own people and just continue to use those levers of power to accept this compromise from the conquerors. So that, yeah, it's the opposite of trickle down. Like, yeah, you trickle down the pain, you trickle down the suffering. It's like, we've been conquered, but the lower classes are going to be ones that really suffer for these conquests. We're going to still hold a lot of our power. We're still going to be vassal states instead of independent kingdoms, but that's better than losing everything. The people at the bottom did lose everything. They get enslaved as a price of conquest. A certain amount of society has to be given into slavery. Same thing happened when, say, the Rhoynar showed up at the Basilisk Isles. The pirate kings were like, we'll let you live here if you give us slaves every year. You got to give us 30 girls, 30 boys, this and that, and we'll leave you alone. And they're like, we can't accept that deal. This is more slavery. Like, how will we decide amongst ourselves who has to be the slaves? And then how will we live with ourselves afterwards, after we send some of our kids away to die like that? So, but the Valyrians know that. The Valyrians know that people act like that. They know that they will fight, that this is the line they'll draw in the sand, and they're used to it. 5,000 years of slavery teaches you how people react to the threat of being enslaved, and you have tactics and strategy to work around that. But there was also, given, again, the big distance is... There's large periods, perhaps multiple generations, if not centuries, where the Freehold just kind of ignored Andalos because it just wasn't worth it for them. It's so far away. They have bigger concerns. There's more money to be made elsewhere. But as I teased before the break, there was at least one example of a huge flight of dragons, and it kind of sounds similar in a lot of ways to what happened with the Rhoynar. Quote,
"The Norvashi sent to Valyria for help, and the Freehold rose to the defense of its distant daughter, though all the lands of the Andals and the Rhoynar lay between them. Distances meant little and less to the Dragonlords in the summer of their power, however. It is written in The Fires of the Freehold that 100 dragons took to the skies following the great river north to descend upon the Andals as they lay siege to Norvas. Carlon the Great burned with his army, and afterward the Dragonlords flew onward, bringing blood and fire to the Isles of Lorath. Carlon's great keep went up in flames, as did the towns and fishing villages along his shores. Even the great stones of the mazes were scorched and blackened by the firestorms that swept across the islands. It is said that not a man, woman, or child survived the Scouring of Lorath. So hot did those fires burn."
Nasty, huh? Like the Rhoynar, when they came to destroy, not conquer. Contrary to a lot of other scenarios, it seems that the Valyrians were more likely to conquer when it was close enough to them that they could manage it. But if it's too far away, they just destroy it. They're like exterminators. They come in and just this will make sure there's no problem again. Kill everyone, right? It's that Roman peace, the version of Roman peace, which is you just kill everyone, and well, that's the end of that problem. So it's the peace of a blasted landscape, the peace of desolation. Sometimes they just wanted to make sure the problem went away. They didn't have an example. So, but it also does the other thing that they like to do every once in a while. Reminds the world of what they're capable of. It says, look what the dragons can do, in case you forgot. Because when those dragons were flying north across the river, like they headed north along the Rhoyne, there would have been a lot of ruined Rhoynar cities that they passed along the way, ruined by their very ancestors. Some of them might have stories they were told as children about great-great-great-grandma Jaehaerys, some Targaryen Valyrian name, right? And how they were there for the burning of Croyane, the great festival city, and they tell stories of how that green marble burned so beautifully in the night. Like, oh gosh, that's terrible. But they would remember it well. And the winners would glorify this conquest, this success, this dominance. And this generation had a chance to be the example setters yet again. Like, we're the ones that get to reestablish Valyrian supremacy by showing the world what we can do. No one will mess with us again. And here it wasn't the Andals weren't attacking the Dragonlords. They weren't attacking Valyria. They were attacking one of the free cities, which had been founded by the Dragonlords, but was one of the free cities. It was ruled independently. It just had Valyria to thank for its protection, and it surely sent taxes and things like that. Again, they called for help. They didn't come on their own. It was like we had to petition them. We had to get them here. What did they maybe had to give something. They maybe had to give tax concessions, or what are you going to do for us? Or maybe they just did it for their own, their own reputation and all that. But again, it's a rare event when you have this political unity within the Dragonlord families to come together to show the world what they're capable of in a way that helps them all equally. No, when they go out and destroy everything, no one family gets to take a lot of wealth home and hold that over the others. If they're all just going in and burning everything in sight, all they get from that is glory, and fear. They don't actually, it doesn't give any of them more status amongst each other or wealth amongst each other, which again is their chief concern. The rest of the world is a playground to them.
They totally destroyed Lorath, but they didn't conquer Lorath.
Right.
Right? So in general, the thing you can't do with a powerful air force is take something over. You can destroy it. And if the 40 families are worried about any one of them getting more powerful than the other, going to destroy something, sure, fine, we'll go destroy it. We just don't want the Joneses to have greener grass than us or whatever, you know?
Yeah.
I think about the
absolutely.
idea of just some kids, some family, some farmer in his field in Lorath. All of a sudden, here come these dragons, just burn everyone, everything to death. It's just so unfair. You know? Like,
yeah, it really is.
You kind of understand why we want to have democracy, so we can kind of keep control over what our leaders are getting mixed up in. And again, how the difference in how modern military, or in George's world, how dragons change things, because you can't. I'm just thinking about, like, in Vietnam, like American bombers just flying over, dropping napalm. Like, Rome couldn't even do that. You know what I mean? Like other ancient empires, you know, even an attack take a while for the soldiers to get there. And it was, you know, they're going to be fighting in fields. It's hard to just suddenly kill all the innocent civilians from hundreds of miles away, just totally wipe them out. It's just like a devastating power for anyone to have these dragons, you know.
Yeah, to think of how that goes to your head too, as a Valyrian dragon rider, you've been sitting at the pinnacle of the world for as long as you can. Plus, your family has been doing that for generations, if not eons, and then you get to go out and do that and remind yourself why you are elite. And so, yes, I am one of the most powerful beings on this planet because I can do this, and there's nothing they can do about it. I can inflict my will upon the world with my 99 cohorts here, all flying dragons too, and they can't even take out one of these, let alone all 100. Yeah, it's really, you're right. It is almost unfair. It's just like there's no contest there, and that creates such a disparity within the world. And they had all this time too. On top of that, they have all this time. They've had thousands of years to figure out the best ways to use this unique power that they have, that they're holding over everyone else. Again, maybe it wasn't written down in military manuals because they might have wanted to keep some of that stuff secret. And maybe some of those have been lost because, you know, if any of it was written down, well, a lot of it would have been destroyed by the Doom. But maybe some of them survived. Like, again, we theorize that Aegon might have been using some established tactics by best ways to use dragons in war. Best ways to use a particularly large dragon like Balerion, one who has particularly higher levels of invulnerability and fear, and the ability to melt a castle, unlike a lot of the other dragons, which their fire isn't quite as hot.
Kind of like when I was thinking about like World War II warfare, like there's a certain, I imagine as dragon gets bigger, its fire can be shot from farther away. Does that make sense? It doesn't have to expose itself as much when it can shoot its fire blast. And if it can be out of the range of an archer but still blast its fire into a castle, that's like got to be like a threshold where strategy changes, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. In general, it just makes me wonder about other books, Valyrian books that are out there. Like, Aegon was seemingly well read, but did he read books that were relevant to dragon conquering and prophecy? While we're at it, those two things, like, we're mostly interested in dragons this episode, not prophecy, but those things do overlap if it was part of his motivation and his preparation. He wanted to do it right. He took it seriously. He's like, well, let me read some things and figure out, you know, maybe I'll learn something from there. Now, in Fire and Blood, for example, we hear that Queen Alysanne, when she went to the Citadel one time, she attended lectures on Valyrian Dragon Wars. That's a topic that she attended. Who knows how good these classes were, how well the literature is, like how well they understand it, what books they're using, but probably pretty good. I wouldn't suspect it's, you know, like National Enquirer stuff. I figure like it's pretty solidly academic texts. They probably got some real books they're working with, some actual history there, but it kind of teases, it's a fun tease to think about. Now, of course, part of the deal with Lorath is that it's in or past Andalos, and a lot of the free cities were founded in that region after Valyria cleared it out, right? They cleared out the Rhoyne and some new cities popped up. A lot of them were Volantene cities or sisters of Volantis. Pentos and Myr and some of these other cities were in this region, especially Qohor and Norvos in particular were in former Andalos. So that those areas were maybe scoured of Andals, many of whom fled to Westeros. and later Valyrian settlers went there. For example, that is what happened at Lorath. It was empty for like 100 years or more. I forget exactly. Check out our episode on Lorath where we go into a lot more detail on it. But eventually it was religious dissidents that left Valyria because they wanted to be they didn't want to be around all the other religions. Valyria was open to all religions. But these guys, they didn't really like that. So some of the religions that didn't like the other, didn't get along, they went, the worshippers of Boash, the blind god, moved to this empty, scoured maze that was left behind. So that was many years later, but it kind of came full circle by people from Valyria that took a place that the Dragonlords had emptied out for them a century before. Now, we do know that the free cities, even though they were partly free, and the word free is not exactly true, but they were smart enough to not make any of the mistakes of the previous cultures in the region. They never... Well, they knew better. Here's what we're told. Quote,
"Dutiful daughters, none ever made war upon Valyria, nor defied the Dragonlords in any matter of significance."
Common sense, really. Like, why would they? They saw what happened to... They also had thousands of years of history to look at and see how the Valyrians dealt with people who stood up to them. And they, by then, would have been aware that there was a time when 300 Dragonlords just came together, and like there was a time when 100, let's just do what they say and make the best of it. Super chat from James Boris. Sorry if I said that wrong. Speaking of anti-air, do you think any non-Valyrian civilization of Essos developed anti-air/dragon tech? Maybe the others, if you buy the other invasion of Essos theory. I do wonder about that. Like the Valyrian, we see the Rhoynar. I mean, they were able to shoot dragons down with just arrows, which seems impossible given Westerosi technology. Like, nothing's even come close to that. Visenya once got an arrow in the shoulder, and it wasn't even a big deal. So that's it. As far as arrows hitting any Targaryen, like of all we know, like it just doesn't seem to have... It's very difficult to do, but it might be a matter of technology. They might just have better bows. Maybe the Rhoynar had... For all we know, they had some magic in their bows. Maybe they had something comparable to Valyrian steel, and not as good, but maybe better than Westerosi steel that would penetrate the armor or dragon scales better. Yeah, you wonder about that. I don't really picture the ice javelin of season 8 kind of thing, but water spouts is pretty high magic. So, like, maybe that's not so crazy that there are things like ice javelins or something like that.
I'd still default to chalking it up to sheer numbers, and potential increase in skill that would come with that. I will also throw out there that a lot of times in this discussion, I was thinking about Avatar: The Last Airbender, because that's some of the sorcery in that world is based around the elements. There's firebenders, waterbenders, earthbenders, right? And there's some variations, like some of the waterbenders can bloodbend, and that's kind of like a dark magic.
Oh,
and often the waterbenders can like turn the water to ice.
That makes sense.
I wonder if that could be a factor. If you could when you said an ice javelin, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like
could the Rhoynar
magically, pull up, a gush of water from a river and sweep it off into the air and crystallize it into ice as it's shooting toward a dragon?
Because it's shards that would be dangerous.
Yeah.
At that velocity, maybe too, if the dragon's in flight, it would add to it.
A bunch of different water droplets becoming little ice shards could rip through a wing or something like that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like, it's like grape shot, but ice shot instead. Instead of a sail, it's a wing. There are enough lessons in the Dance of the Dragons alone for multiple episodes in terms of dragon versus dragon and dragon versus army. There are some innovations, or some lessons were remembered. For example, Westeros did recall some of the lessons of Aegon's conquest, which was don't put 50,000 soldiers in one place when you're facing dragons. Smaller armies make sense. So the blacks and the greens at least had that level of sense. And let's talk about Westeros, starting with Aegon, or actually not Aegon. Let's go to his more immediate ancestors after the Doom, the Targaryens of Dragonstone. A lot depends on Rhoynar the Exile and those in charge of his household. And what I mean by that is they had wealth accumulated over centuries, if not longer. And what they brought with them to Westeros, and I don't mean people and artifacts, although those are interesting too, just the books The knowledge they brought with them represents a large portion of all the surviving dragon lore in the world, given that we should assume that a huge percentage of it was destroyed by the Doom itself. And as we've talked about before, there may have been some reluctance to write down some of these things in the first place, given some of it might have been like the equivalent of corporate secrets. You don't want other families, Dragon Rider families, to know what you know, unless you're exchanging secrets. Maybe that's worthwhile. Maybe some of them have alliances where certain secrets of dragon lore and dragonkind are traded behind the scenes there. I mean, Dragonstone has to have some scrolls, right? But are these scrolls going to contain the kind of common wisdom that we're speaking to directly in this episode of why it's stupid to have dragons fight each other? Maybe they just took that for granted because it's common sense to them. Maybe after so long it became so ingrained that they didn't need to say it anymore, that it was just too obvious, which is the condition that eventually leads to it being forgotten, or the reason why it was emphasized, the underpinning cultural reasons, the underpinning thought process is lost. It's like having an ancient device that functions really well, but you've lost the instructions for it. You've lost the manuals for it. You still have it still works, but you forgot why it was developed and the best ways to use it. Forgot is using a term applied to a whole culture or a whole group of people rather than, they didn't literally forget. It's like, how did that work again? You know, it's like they got amnesia. No, it's not that, of course. Since we're told no dragons fought each other in Westeros until Balerion fought Quicksilver during Maegor's ascension, that means the dragons of the Lords of Dragonstone era never fought one another that we know of, though they might have done it just without dragons, right? So what I'm saying here is the pre-royal Targaryens didn't fight each other, or at least if they did, it wasn't using dragons. At least not in a way that any dragon died because of it. But we're said they literally didn't fight. No dragon fought dragon in the sky since Valyria. When Maegor and Aegon the Uncrowned fought, it was the first time since then. Maybe they got well enough. Maybe they lacked the ambition for infighting. Who knows? But the Lords of Dragonstone, they kept it tight. They kept unity, at least to a certain point. Maybe there was just a lot of collective trauma about the loss of Valyria. Like, wow, like that's a big deal. Like it had only happened 20, 30, 40 years ago. Does that put you in a conquering mood? I don't know how these things work, but the Century of Blood itself was pretty brutal too. I mean, maybe they just, maybe some nasty fates befell some of the Targaryens on their dragons in outside conflicts, just not against each other. Maybe they kept the wisdom of not fighting each other, but they went and got embroiled in various events that happened during the Century of Blood, and that some of them may have not come back from that. I mean, Aegon did this. He fought against the Volantines. He burned a fleet at least that was trying to invade. And maybe he wasn't the first to get involved. He was just more successful. The dragons that were older than Balerion, he was the youngest of the 5 dragons that came over. They died, maybe all of them of old age? Maybe. But that's maybe not. You know, that's you can see why there's room to think that maybe something else happened, but we know it wasn't dragon versus dragon. So interestingly, the population of dragons actually declined in this time frame. You'd think that they'd really want to make sure that the dragons didn't go extinct, but they also didn't want anyone else to have dragons. They weren't marrying out a lot. This was a period of the Targaryens sort of looking inward, staying inward. They weren't expanding. They weren't conquering. It's a big point. There's a lot of missing info here. We don't know a lot about these Targaryens, but it may have been a strategy. They could have hatched more eggs if they wanted to. But they just didn't want anyone else getting dragons and riding them. It was a tense, it was a touch and go kind of period.
They might have wanted to consolidate this. They might have rather have 3 really big, powerful, strong dragons than 10 average dragons.
Yeah.
That makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
Let's get Balerion big enough that he can burn down a freaking castle, and then we can start cultivating some younger ones.
And they didn't even have 10 riders. Yeah. So like they couldn't.
Right.
Yeah.
There may have been, because one thought is like maybe they want to like preserve the dragons and start repopulating. That's one reason we see like we can't risk fighting each other. We can't even risk fighting other people. Maybe Aegon knew he could risk burning some ships down because it's not really a risk, right?
Yeah.
But we definitely can't have them fighting each other. But that conflicts with the idea of the population declining. But maybe it's because they were trying to get 1 or 2 dragons up to a certain threshold of strength.
Yeah.
that they could burn fire down from a distance greater than archers could reach. The fire is strong enough to melt stone or whatever. Again, maybe lessons that they knew from old Valyria that had been lost or written down, or records don't exist, or whatever else.
So
it could also be all part of a prophecy. Maybe they knew they needed to have X number or a dragon of X size. Or
dragon must have 3 heads.
Yeah.
So, because it's definitely curious, because they could have hatched more if they wanted to. Like when Jaehaerys and Alicent had a bunch of kids, there were a lot of eggs to go around. Like they didn't all become dragon riders, but it wasn't because they weren't allowed to. For the most part, some of them, maybe in 1 or 2 cases, but for the most part, like they weren't like nope. It was just as many dragons as there are Targaryens. So. There's another thing here, Sean, that we've brought up a few times. It's like it must be really expensive to upkeep dragons. These are not the Targaryens with the wealth of Valyria anymore. And they're not the Targaryens of the Iron Throne that had the taxation of the entire continent. So maybe it was actually a part due to cost. We can't actually, we should keep fewer dragons because it's so expensive. It's hard to imagine the Targaryens ever having money problems. It's kind of like, really? Did they? But it's possible. Like, this is where's all their money coming from at this point? Like, they have this small island, whereas before they must have had massive holdings. Some of it would just be stored wealth. They sold off their property in Valyria, which was most certainly the most expensive real estate on the planet. But eventually you'd run out of money. We're talking generations and generations here with a severely reduced income from what they had been operating on. So it could be something more mundane like that.
Yeah, it could also be, like, aside from money, just like the ranging territory where the dragons would feed.
Yeah.
They don't want to have to get too far away to find enough food for the younger ones. I didn't even think of this till just now. It could also be that they wanted there to be a disparity between the bigger, older dragons and the younger, newer dragons.
That's possible.
Make sure when we start breeding new ones, that these young upstart kids don't dare challenge the elder Targaryens with these massive dragons. Maybe
I like that idea.
There to be a bigger disparity.
Anyway, so escalating cost is another form of the dragon's undoing, we could say. Expenses do matter. Now, the conquest. Let's talk about that. The Iron Throne may be the thing that made the end of dragons inevitable, or at least made it not unlikely. Because the Valyrians were a freehold, and the name freehold is as laughable as free cities, given the widespread violent dominance and slavery they inflicted on the region around them for eons. Internally, it's a sign of their pragmatism. They're like, yeah, they learned not to fight each other, at least not with dragons, as we said, and had a system apparently built around keeping that status quo, of reminding themselves of why they shouldn't fight each other with dragons. Again, we said there must have been exceptions, times when dragon fought dragon, but that must have been resolved, and clearly it didn't end them because they were able to continue as a society beyond that. A throne, I think, did destroy the blacks and greens, and that throne never existed in Valyria. They knew better than to do that. They knew better than to play the Game of Thrones, because when you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die. Let's play the game of Freehold. That's a better game for us. 40 of us can win. 40 families can win. Yeah, the phrase is when you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die, but the dragons die even when you win. That's why you can't play that game. You win or you die, but all the dragons die. The people survive, but all the dragons are going to die. So,
and a lot of people die too, for what it's worth.
Yeah.
If only the dragons fought the dragons, okay, but it's the dragons and people fighting dragons and people. So
yeah. So maybe we should consider blaming Aegon the Conqueror for forgetting how important it was to not do that when you have dragon. Maybe he thought because they're all in one family, they'll all stay united, but that's naive. The throne is too much of a temptation. It didn't take, his own sons fought over the throne. I mean, it took 1 generation for them to start fighting over it. And arguably that was a mistake on his part too, in creating 2 branches and not doing enough to reconcile them before the time. Just like Viserys created 2 branches and just kind of demanded that they get along. He didn't really do much to make it happen, just kind of ordered them. You must get along because I say so. But when you're dead and not ordering them to get along, what's going to make them get along? They're not getting along even with you telling them to. So what's going to make that happen when you're gone? Yeah.
I made that argument that I thought that Viserys/Rhaenyra should have been flying on their dragons to all the different kingdoms that had sworn allegiance, just like Aegon did. It's just this reminder. but they didn't.
They didn't.
And so when the time comes for this civil war, all the other houses are like, yeah, I'll fight for you. Yeah, I'll fight for you. But if they had seen these dragons and like, I'm going to wait till I really have to choose. You sure you want to? There would have been more negotiating effort. There would have been more standoffishness. There would have been, I think it would have been a whole different scenario if everyone had been constantly reminded of the power of the dragons.
I think you're right. And I think that's part of what they forgot. Like, they forgot it was important to show people the power of the dragons. They, kind of like what Stannis realized, at first Stannis thought the throne belonged to him and that everyone should just get in line with that. And he realized, no, it doesn't work that way. That's sort of how these two sides are behaving. Rhaenyra is sort of acting like, yeah, the throne's mine. It was promised to me. I get it. Period. The Greens are like, no, it should belong to the man. We get it. We took it. We seized the opportunity. You should back down. These are not good arguments for owning the throne, for having the throne. Stannis was like, yeah, no, I should earn it. I should show that I'm the best king. And like, the Blacks and Greens never learned that lesson. But usually you don't get a second chance. To be fair, Stannis got a second chance, which is rare. And it's probably not going to result in him winning the throne in the long run anyway.
Not with that attitude.
Not with that attitude, yeah. So wouldn't that be really ironic if Aegon's dreams told him he had to unite the Seven Kingdoms to face this threat, and then he did this thing that led to the destruction of his own family, the very family that's supposed to be there to stop this threat? Because that is what happened. They blew up all their dragons. They lost the advantage. They lost the advantage. They lost the thing that's best. And that is how prophecies
go, right? When you try to like live up to or fight against a prophecy, it always blows up in your face.
So it's obviously very hard to know exactly what he was thinking or dreaming or both. Not to mention what advice he got from anyone he brought it up to, which we can assume he didn't keep it all to himself, or else how would anybody know about it? I'm talking book, obviously, because in show, of course, he told people. But we don't know exactly who. Did he tell Visenya? Did he tell Rhaenys? Did he tell them both? Did he tell Aenys? Did he tell Maegor? Good questions, but we don't have the answers. Was some of this written down in the Citadel? Was it read in the library at Dragonstone? Did he rediscover something that past Dragon Lords already knew? Again, the night attack on Harrenhal. Was that something he read about? It was like a good way to keep them from getting good aim at you, is to attack at night. The fires that you light with your dragon will be all the light you need. You can see the moonlight will be enough for you. That won't be enough for them, and they're going to be afraid, and you will be the thing that's making them afraid. They will be less afraid if they can see you, which is kind of ironic because dragons are very terrifying to look at, but still.
It's not like they won't be afraid if they can see you. They'll just be even more afraid if they can't see you.
Yeah, what we know for more certainty is that Aegon had the most powerful dragon in the world, and it may have been one that stood out as huge even back when there were hundreds of dragons. It's entirely possible that when 100 dragons went to torch Lorath, or when 300 dragons went to torch the Rhoynar, that Balerion would have stood out as one of the biggest, if not the biggest, even then. Because damn, that's a big dragon. I gotta figure he wasn't the biggest ever. Like that's a lot, to think that but it would explain a lot of Aegon's ambition, just realizing what he had here. It's like with this dragon, you can do more than these books say you can do with a large dragon. It's even bigger. Like you can go even beyond that. Because the conquest was relatively easy until Dorne.
It's a new thought for me to have, but I do wonder if they were sizing Balerion up in those 100 years before they moved on Westeros.
Yeah, and I've got more on Balerion's size coming when we get to Maegor, so stay tuned for that. Another thing Westeros learned during the conquest was that the obvious, which is don't use ships. It's a really bad idea to use ships. They're the most vulnerable. Somehow they did need to learn that lesson again, apparently, and learn it they did. They also learned that a dragon, even in a rainstorm, even a vicious downpour where they can't fly, still very formidable. Meraxes proved that at the Battle of the Last Storm, which is an episode we did with Jim McGeehan for patrons and subscribers only. Check that out if you're so inclined. So yeah, the Field of Fire and the Burning of Harrenhal, those we talked about those during Valar Rereadus. We pointed out repeatedly that those are examples designed to stand the test of time, to remind people of the power of dragons. It was so perfect in part because the Field of Fire, largest army ever assembled, and see what happened to it. That's the kind of thing people are going to remember. Burning of Harrenhal, well, it's still there. Harrenhal is still burned and sitting there. So it just, obviously that stands the test of time. And it worked. A lot of, the Starks gave up. The Aarons gave up after just a little bit, after just having their navy torched. So it worked. It got a lot of people to surrender ahead of time. And to think that people would go against this, let's not forget the real world. People like you said, Sean, when machine guns were invented, people still did the front lines strategy, even though they were running right at machine guns and bombs and flamethrowers. So you think people won't charge a dragon? You think that's unrealistic? Let me introduce you to real life where people charge at machine guns and bombs and flamethrowers. Flamethrower being perhaps the best example because it's what dragons do. People will charge right at that. It's crazy. It's like, wow, you got to really, that's a mindset I don't ever expect to have, and hopefully not for all of us. And the Tullys sort of also bent the knee like the Starks and Aarons, but for them it was sort of not wanting to face dragons, but also wanting to not be under Harren the Black anymore. So there was a double whammy there. Now Dorne, of course, didn't go so well for the Targaryens. The Dornish were like, we don't have to surrender. We don't value our castles as much as we value people. Go ahead and burn the castles. We'll hide in the caves and strike later. But remember how it started. Meraxes just showed up with Rhaenys. Well, Rhaenys showed up on Meraxes, burned the Planky town, a center of great economic activity. This was devastating. And then that continued. Since Dorne didn't surrender, the Targaryens kept using this same playbook. We'll destroy more of your country until you give up. We won't give up. We'll destroy more of your country until you get... We won't give up. And eventually Dorne was reduced to, quote, a smoking ruin. There was glass on the sand in some places. Every castle was burned repeatedly except Sunspear, which was done to maybe get the Dornish to turn on each other to show that, hey, but it didn't work. And the Targaryens didn't have another gear to shift to. They're like, this has always worked. What do we do? But the irony of this, in terms of like looking at it as a historical example, it shows us of what the dragons are really capable of. It's like, if they keep going, they will just blow up every castle in the entire region. They will destroy every farm. Or maybe that was obvious, but
yeah, even they were able to bring 300 or even 100, or Shea pointed out 30 probably would have done it. They didn't have 30, but still, 2 or 3 could still just destroy a whole country. You don't even need 30, just 2 or 3.
Yeah, it took longer with 2 or 3, but it was just as assuredly done. And
it partly took longer because they didn't really even want to do that. They wanted to conquer them, or they wanted to bring them in and have people to rule and taxes to collect. But so they dragged it out, but it still was terrible losses all around. And
the Dragonlords didn't want anyone to see this strategy work. They didn't want this strategy to work because then they would encourage other people to do it, even though it's a devastating strategy that's hard to use. Last thing they want is a winning strategy shown to the world. It's like, this is how you beat dragons.
No. That said, I still question your terminology, work and winning strategy. I still don't think the reach was something like, we can fight against the dragons just like Dorne. Like, I don't think anyone else wanted to use Dorne's strategy.
No, you're right. But that seems to be part of maybe the Targaryens' thinking is like, no, we can't. Yeah. We got to make sure we win here. They didn't. They had to give up. But because of the cloak and dagger and assassination attempts, the kind of stuff that we suspect was going on in Valyria rather than the dragons just directly fighting each other. And if Dorne had dragons of their own, well, would Aegon would just probably never have invaded them. They would have maybe would have gone straight to marriage offers right off the bat, or who knows?
And cloak and dagger assassination attempts or whatever else,
Yeah. So it would have been like them.
Think how many innocent lives would have been saved.
Yeah, this is partly why. I mean, in the real world, it's a tough argument. This is why people argue, like, there should be more states with nukes, because then there would be... It's a tough argument. It's like, you can see the downside to that for sure, but this is the upside. It's like, well, no one will ever invade them because that nuke is pointed at that invading country. And so the death of Meraxes also was another reminder of why they're reluctant to use the dragons, even when it's a cakewalk, even when it's easy, even when there's very little they can do to fight back, because you might get unlucky. If you never have to use your dragon... If you only use it as a threat, it's not getting shot in the eye by a scorpion bolt, is it? Right? It's not crashing it's not the end of the war, basically, because you capture the dragon rider and use that as leverage against his beloved husband or her beloved husband, etc. So, as you said earlier, Sean, Aegon and his sisters famously failed in Dorne, but they kept up the pressure on their vassals by just friendly parties. I show up with my entourage. We hang out. We go hunting and hawking. These aren't equals, though. These aren't friends at the same social level, enjoying, their equal status. This is one guy with the silk glove rather than the gauntlet. The gauntlet's outside chowing down on an aurochs, intimidating the hell out of everybody. But that's the way. That's such a good way to do it, because these lords are so proud. They have so much pride that pride will make them do stupid things, and Aegon knows that. He's like, well, this is the way to assuage their pride without rubbing their faces in it. Like, look, I will destroy you, and this is proof of it. Bend the knee now. No, they show up and like, yeah, we're friends. Because the unspoken threat is there. They're not stupid. The Field of Fire's already happened. Dorne has already happened. They know what happens. You don't have to remind them. You don't have to be like Maegor will be. You don't have to rub their faces in it. But you also shouldn't be like Aenys, who goes the extreme opposite and doesn't rub their faces in it even a little bit, is afraid to use his dragon in any form of violence. Aegon did the thing that Tytos pulled kind of like a Jaime Lannister, to use the books as an example. When Jaime is very nice to Tytos Blackwood, he doesn't make him actually bend the knee, just makes him agree, makes him say, yeah, you can send whatever hostage you want. But when he's leaving, he's like, let me remind you, this was unnecessary. Jaime's like, he steps back, like kind of goofs just a little bit. Like, he didn't have to say this, but maybe this was for the reader. He's like, just to be clear, I will come back here and kill you all if you give me cause. He's like, yeah, I know who I'm dealing with, Kingslayer. He says that. He's like, yeah, I know. Like, the smile comes off his face. Like, yeah, you didn't have to say that. Like, we were exchanging the subtleties properly. I read between the lines. It was obvious, bro. You didn't have to say that. And this is the same thing going on here. Like, Aegon's like, yeah, you don't have to rub my face. And I know exactly what your giant dragon chowing on an aurochs means.
By the way, it's a little bit of a tangent, but I read that a little bit as like Jaime reminding himself. He's like, I can't be their friends. I still have to be ruthless.
You're kind of right. Yeah, he kind of was reminding himself. Yeah, because he also says that to Haas, the hostage. He's like, this isn't a game, little kid. He's like, oh, I'm sorry. My bad, Sir Jaime. So Aenys, let's talk about Aenys. It's amazing how well the first four kings provide us a different look into the insight of how they use dragons. Aegon showed what he would do, proved it all, made all examples of a lot of people, and then backed off and was just like, let that do the talking for the rest of his reign. Aenys relied maybe too much on what his father had done and didn't reestablish the examples, which he needed to do, because they're like, well, you're not your dad. You're not the guy. You're not the one who did this. So he had a dragon, Quicksilver. Several of his children would be Dragonards as well. But he really showed that willpower is everything when it comes to draconic authority. If you aren't willing to use your dragon, you effectively don't have one. And that was the message that developed in Aenys's very short reign. Aenys's father instilled fear in everyone. He reminded them of what he was capable of and what he had done. Again, Harrenhal and Field of Fire, not very far in the past. Visual example in Harrenhal's case. That's never going to not be true. He was willing to be a dragon, but over time, and right away, because some rebellions broke out almost as soon as Aenys took the throne, he was unable to fulfill the standard set by his father, and everyone knew it. In fact, they had probably learned that while he was prince. A lot of them got to meet him face to face and took his mettle and realized, well, he's more of the copper, like Renly. That example where the three Baratheons are compared to types of metal. Well, Aegon would be Valyrian steel, Aenys would be copper, Maegor would be iron, breaks before he bends, right? Those also work in this example. When he took the throne, more than 25 years had passed since his father's examples, his violent examples. He had still been making the non-violent examples all along. Quicksilver never killed a person that we know of. And I bet not a lot of people knew that. Aenys never killed a person with his dragon. He never used his dragon for violence at all. So when all these small rebellions broke out, and Aenys sent no dragons, not just to not himself. He didn't deploy any dragon riders. people got the message, right? They were like, he's just shy about using the dragons. But it wasn't the Valyrian shyness to the risk of using them. This was actual shyness. This was actual anxiety of restraint. Maybe he doesn't want to kill people. Maybe he's a little bit of a pacifist. We don't exactly know.
I want to say, like, I understand maybe his responsibility as a leader, and especially in the context of this world and the wars and dragons and fantasy adventure and everything. But in my mind, he's doing the right thing. The only reason we have any judgment on him is because these other people are doing the wrong thing. And our expectation for him to deal with people doing the wrong thing is to go burn them to death. It's, I want him to be more heroic. I wish we knew more about him. I wish we weren't talking about his failures and not being more violent, you know?
But if he had
everyone else was failing and wanting to be violent. That's how I see it.
Yeah. And he was unable to meet that challenge. Meanwhile, Maegor, who eventually claimed Balerion, must have been shaking his head in frustration. He's like, I've got the big dragon. This is a guy who saw fewer of the subtleties and intimidation and saw it as a very straightforward thing. And he was more than willing to do it, right? But eventually, Aenys and Maegor had issues with each other. Maegor took his brother's forbearance as opportunity, took a second wife, maybe on Visenya's advice, his mom's advice, and this brought things to a head. Maegor was exiled, which probably embroiled the crown's enemies even more. They're like, oh, the one guy that's actually capable of harming us has been exiled. Well, that just gave them more license to do their dirty deeds. But even with Visenya there, sticking around, because she didn't leave, she was still there. People were afraid of her. But he continually projected weakness, went against her advice, and these rebels kept doing awful things. I mean, these aren't rebels just fighting for independence. These are people like Harren the Red that was just a bandit, basically, a glorified brigand. He's not fostering any grand cause. So, yeah. So over time, more and more of these things happen, and more of the time, he refuses to do hardly anything, not send dragons. He barely even sent armies. So,
like, what did the Warden of the South and a Warden of the West, what did they do about these bandits? So why isn't it them failing and not Aenys, you know?
Well, yeah, he didn't give them clear order. Like, on one hand, they should be doing it on their own, but they kind of waited for orders that never came. Yeah, so you're right. He's maybe taking a little too much blame here. But they also would have realized that how long is this guy going to last? He's not going to be king forever. He probably won't be king for 30 years like his father was. So how long is this opportunity? They got a weak king, seize the advantage now before something changes. And yeah, something did change pretty quickly. A good example of this, though, of this principle of taking an opportunity, when you have a weak king, you can maybe just say sorry before you have any consequences. Look at what the Three Sisters did during the conquest. They declared themselves independent of the Seven Kingdoms entirely. No new Iron Throne for them, no rule by the Veil either. And then Vhagar flew there, and they backed down before a single ship was burned. And this is why we suspect they had put a puppet ruler up, because then they could punish that puppet ruler and say, look, we removed her. We're on your side. It was her all along. You know, it sounded like, can we get away with this? Let's do this. But it's like they put one toe into the Independence water. That toe is another person's toe, or rather another person's head or tongue, because she lost her tongue. And when she was sent to the Silent Sisters, that's Marla Sunderland, of course. So Aenys' reign was, so there's probably a couple of those cases where they're like, well, we'll just apologize. We'll do everything we can. Then when Aenys finally, you know, if he ever gets us cornered, we'll just apologize and bend the knee, and that'll be it. He's reluctant to execute people, sure. So it was a good gamble by some bad people, probably, because it did work. That's what I mean by a good gamble. Obviously, it's not very ethical. And this, by the way, is the source for a lot of the theories behind Visenya's either assisting her nephew's death or causing it outright, because she's just like, we're losing it. We're losing the throne. We're losing our reputation. The fear that keeps everyone in line. We're losing it. You're establishing a reputation the opposite of what me and your father tried to do. Even your deceased mother was on board with that, King Aenys. But anyway, on to Maegor. Huge contrast here, night and day, when there's one king who was too reluctant to use force and one that was way too willing to use it. Gotta find that middle ground. Yeah, gotta find that middle ground, you know. when Visenya and Maegor turned their dragons south towards Old Town and the Starry Sept, it was like, no, we surrender, whatever you want. Just like when Aegon himself declared war on the Seven Kingdoms, the Old Town and the Starry Sept were like, pass. Well, we bend the knee. Yeah. I had a dream. Yeah. The gods told me. It wasn't my decision. Yeah. So he did appear, but even Maegor appeared maybe somewhat reluctant to go dragon versus dragon. There were times when like Rhaena didn't cede to his authority, and others just kind of were reluctant to, like, didn't come to him or didn't obey him. But he was reluctant to come to them either. He wanted to stay at the capital, do his business. He had buildings to construct, his holdfast and the dragon pit and all these other things. So he kind of understood that, maybe because he was a warrior, that stuff happens in battle. You know, you shouldn't shirk from battle, but you don't necessarily need to go seek it out either when it's dragon versus dragon. Of course, he did that when he seized the throne in the first place, when Aegon the Uncrowned raised an army with the intent of fighting Balerion, or fighting Maegor. This is when we got our war. And it wasn't really a contest at all, though. So Aegon the Uncrowned, good example of, was he too proud to back down? Like, this just seems like a obviously bad idea. You got a dragon the quarter the size of Balerion, and you're going to go after him? Not only is Balerion experienced and Maegor experienced, Aegon wasn't. Quicksilver wasn't. I just pointed out, under Aenys, who Quicksilver was born with, no war, no fighting. This was a dragon that had never fought in a battle. And he's going to go take on Balerion? There's some missing piece here. Maybe Aegon was a little insane. That's a Targaryen thing. Maybe he read some books and read about smaller dragons being more maneuverable. Maybe he thought he could pull it off. He could kill Maegor and not kill Balerion. Anyway, all these things are possible. It's possible he thought he could do that. It's possible it could have been successful. We don't know. Here's what we do know. Quote.
15,000 men had joined the rebellion as Aegon the Uncrowned began his march across the Riverlands to stake his claim to the Iron Throne, led by the prince himself on King Aenys' beloved dragon, Quicksilver. Before declaring for the Prince of Dragonstone, they wished to be convinced he might prevail. For the first time since the doom of Valyria, dragon contended with dragon in the sky, even as battle was joined below. Quicksilver, a quarter the size of Balerion, was no match for the older, fiercer dragon, and her pale white fireballs were engulfed and washed away in great gouts of black flame. Screaming and smoking, the young dragon plunged to earth, and Prince Aegon with her.
So the dragons never got to grips with each other. They never had physical contact in the battle that we are told here. It was all fire, which is maybe how more of them go than we know. We don't have a lot of examples of dragon aerial combat, but you can see here, even looks like Aegon wasn't trying to get close, which is smart. Like, don't get close to the bigger dragon. He was trying to use fire to maybe kill Maegor and be done with it. But Balerion was up to that contest too, with hotter fire and enough to burn this dragon to death. It would no tooth or talons were ever involved. It was just purely the dragon flame. It makes sense.
I again suspect that Balerion has a greater range. Can just
maybe
fire from farther away. You know.
Yeah, maybe Aegon was overconfident in maneuverability and thought, you know, like, again, he couldn't have tested these things in advance. You know, like, how could he have known? So, and maybe that's how he talked people into it. He's like, look, I'll be able to beat Maegor. He's slow. You know, I'll be able to do this. He must have 15,000 men were following him. They clearly believed in his chances, and they probably gave up. They gave up immediately afterwards since this dragon was killed. And we're like, oh, that was quick. And there's that quote that we were relying on to show that there hadn't been dragon versus dragon combat during the time of the Targaryens of Dragonstone. Because it says for the first time since the Doom, dragons fighting each other or contending in the skies. And so, yeah, Maegor might have, again, you see someone like Gregor Clegane, he's a dummy. Everybody points that out. But when it comes to combat, he's not entirely stupid. He understands sunlight and, like having the sun at your back and certain things about fear and morale. And yeah, Maegor, as suicidal and psychopathic as he might have been, he had some sense of preservation and strategy. So those are things he probably wasn't stupid about. Yeah, use the ranged weapon. Don't get burned to death. Let's continue with the battle. There's another quote here that sparks a little further discussion. Here it is.
Amongst the dead were Lord Alan Tarbeck, Dennis Snow, the bastard of Barrowton, Lord Ronald Vance, Sir Willem Whistler, Melanie Piper and 3 of her brothers, and the Prince of Dragonstone, Aegon the Uncrowned of House Targaryen. Would the addition of a second dragon to the prince's host have made a difference when battle was joined?
We don't know. We've theorized about this already. Like, what difference would that make? How much difference would it make? We got to feel like in some cases it would totally make a big difference. Maybe not in all cases. And the reason it's being asked here is that Aegon's sister wife, Rhaena, on Dreamfire did not participate. And they're wondering, had she participated, maybe it would have gone differently. Maybe there would have been 2 dead dragons and 2 dead dragoners. This is Balerion we're talking about, but maybe Balerion would have been severely harmed. It could have changed a lot.
Yeah, I think it would have definitely made a difference. I don't know if they necessarily would have defeated Maegor and Balerion, but I think they would have. I think a second dragon, they might not have defeated Balerion, but I think they would have defeated Maegor. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Probably at the expense of one or the other of them. I think one dragon and its rider dies while the other one takes out Maegor. That's what I think.
So that may have been a question Rhaena asked herself the whole rest of her life. She may have gone to her deathbed wondering that question. And she lived a long time. Now, and she lived past Maegor. Maegor didn't have a long reign, so she at least got to see him dead in the ground. And Maegor the Cruel earned that nickname. It wasn't exaggerated. Him being stupid might be a little exaggerated. He did some stupid things, but he did some clever things too. He kind of reminds me of Cersei in some ways. Like when he gets angry, he gets real stupid, and he got angry a lot, like Cersei. But like Cersei, did some pretty clever things, some cunning things. And here's one thing he did that was smart, maybe. At least they would rate it under this topic as smart. He didn't focus on the throne. He wasn't concerned with the Iron Throne. He was concerned with Balerion. He didn't claim a younger dragon. He didn't claim a hatchling. He was waiting for Balerion to be available. And then when he had Balerion, then the throne was easy to take because he had the biggest dragon. So it was like focus on the means to take the throne rather than taking the throne, because then you can hold it, right? You have Balerion and the throne, but one helps you hold the other. And a guy like Maegor, who sees things a lot more like straightforwardly, he's not a subtle guy. This makes sense to him. And he may have been encouraged in this by his mother. Like, have a dragon, have the big dragon. This is where the source of our power. This is why people fear us. Without these dragons, we're just like everybody else with silver hair, And the silver hair doesn't intimidate anybody. The dragons do, even when you don't use them. So he makes for an interesting case study because he kind of understood on a very basic level where the real power was. The Iron Throne was the seat of power, but the real seat of power was the saddle of Balerion. That's the real seat of power, because that's what best enables you to take the Iron Throne, or to forge the Iron Throne in the first place, which is what literally happened. So he also kind of maybe understood that part of why it will help him hold the throne is that even another dragon coming after him, he's got a good chance to win that, which is a very difficult thing to win without taking severe damage or even the rider surviving. He probably understood that. And this is a guy who had a chip on his shoulder in the first place. He wasn't firstborn. He felt jilted a bit. He thought more capable of his brother. And who else feels that way? Let's think of the blacks and the greens. Prince Aemond, of course, also feels he has a chip on his shoulder. He also isn't firstborn. He also feels more competent than his older brother. A lot in common. Plus, they also are the rider of the largest dragon of their time. Yep. And Vhagar has been the largest dragon in the realm for decades by the time Aemond claimed him, because Balerion died in like the year, 92 or 93? But back to Maegor for now. He got most of Westeros to see sense again, in that the quick, relatively historical period of 5-ish years of Aenys being in charge, where people forgot to be afraid of dragons because no one was using them in a manner that would make you afraid of them. Maegor restored that pretty fast. It's like, all right, yes, we should be afraid of the dragons. We should be afraid of how they're used. That's one thing he accomplished. Except for the Zealots. The Faith of the Seven were not down for bending the knee to Maegor or any dragon rider, and violence be damned, it wasn't going to intimidate them. That's the way of Zealots, right? They're more worried about the penalties in the afterlife than they are the penalties in the current life. So they were willing to go up against him in a manner that we suspect might have been reminiscent of the early wars of the Faith and Andals, because we talked about Zealots there as well. They might have been willing to face some dragon flame. Didn't help them in the long run. The lack of fear didn't win them many, maybe they won some battles, but they didn't have much success against Maegor. I'm talking about maybe they had some success back in their homeland. But in the long run, of course, it didn't work. Kicked off the Andal migrations to Westeros because of how bad it was going. This must have sent quite the message, too. Even the faith will stand up to Maegor, but they can't win. Even when you're just like locked in, even with God on your side, you still lost. That's exactly the kind of message that Visenya and Maegor valued. Like, yeah, they came at us with everything they had and they still lost. Perfect. That's exactly what we wanted to demonstrate. Like, see, don't try in the future because this is what happens. They needed someone to try to prove that it was hopeless. And yeah, it didn't go very well. Is this something we'll see in A Song of Ice and Fire? Will we see... I mean, the undead will be fearless against any foe, but will the Dothraki, they'll be, the dragon will be on their side when Dany fights, but not when the dragons, not the Dothraki who were trying to capture Dany. So that's a different matter. Like, will they be fearless against that? I mean, it's such a big part of their culture to not show fear, but this is the ultimate test, a flying, fire-breathing monster that your arrows seem to be useless against. Now, Sean, earlier you brought up the size of Balerion, and I liked your theory on maybe they wanted to have a generation of dragons that were way far ahead of the others so that they would, yes, there'd be other dragons, but they would have 50 years of size or the equivalent on the new ones. Maegor is responsible for the dragon pit. The dragon pit kept dragons from growing to their maximum size. It's interesting that he might have done that on purpose. He's already got the biggest dragon. Now I make sure no one ever has one as big as me. Interesting. Maybe that was part of his angle.
Do you think he realized the dragon pit would have that effect? I don't know if
I don't
give him that much credit.
Yeah. I don't. Yeah, we don't know if they knew it would limit growth, but it might have. It might be something in the document. It might be in the literature. It might be something the Valyrians figured out. You would think the Valyrians would figure that out. It's pretty basic. They're breeding and growing dragons for eons. You'd think they'd notice that one's grown inside versus outside. There's differences. They had a lot of time to notice that.
I wonder if maybe even someone else figured that out, but didn't even tell Maegor. They just, hey, let's build a dragon. Maybe they had this motive of limiting the growth of dragons, but didn't necessarily let Maegor or anyone know that.
Yeah. That's a good point. It's entirely possible. So I wonder about that. I wonder if there was an angle to this. Because, yeah, Maegor maybe not have noticed that, but maybe Visenya did. Maybe Visenya noticed that. Because you can put things past Maegor that are harder to put past Visenya. But they may not have had that knowledge. That might be another piece of lost knowledge. Like, maybe they just, yeah. It might have been something that was so obvious back in the day that it wasn't written down anymore. I think we brought this up before on the show. Roman concrete. The ingredients called for water. It was seawater. They didn't bother to write that down because they're like, of course it's seawater. They didn't, that.
Why would we use good drinking water?
Yeah, that knowledge was lost because it seemed too obvious. So this is a good example. Maybe the Valyrians just stopped writing that down because it was so obvious. Like, of course, if you put them in a small building, they won't grow to their full size. That does seem kind of obvious when you lay it out like that. I mean, pretty much any animal, that's not true. There are some animals that don't work like that, but maybe that's obvious to me because I've had aquariums my whole life, but you can't, fish will definitely, most animals will not grow to a size that would trap them in their enclosure.
There's also the idea that even if something is quote unquote obvious, the concept of the principle might be obvious, but the details might not be obvious or known even.
Yeah.
Like, humans, for even prehistorical humans, even animals understand on some level gravity. Right?
Yes.
But it's relatively recent that we actually understood the details of gravity, the rate of acceleration, and what causes all the, the mathematics behind it isn't obvious.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Mm-mm.
And so maybe dragon lords or even Maegor understood that a dragon pit limits how big or how quick a dragon can grow, but how much, what is the rate of growth, what is the limit of growth, etc. That might not have been exactly known. So.
Though he focused on Balerion rather than the Iron Throne, as we said, Maegor died on the throne, not in the saddle, which goes to show which one truly gave him power, at least the kind he most relished in. It would have been a lot harder to kill him in the saddle, but what is he going to do? Stay in the saddle 24/7? Got to get off sometime, bro. So before the other kings, though, let's take a look at a great quote involving Princess Rhaena, who existed during and after the time of Maegor, and before. Well, not before. Before he was a king, but she wasn't older than him, is my point. She had married Aegon, her brother that was killed, and she was the oldest, though. She was older than him, and she was rider of Dreamfire. For a while, she lived on Fair Isle. Remember we talked about how she was kind of in fear of maybe him coming for her. He never did. Eventually, though, the Lord Farman that had taken her in died, and the son took over, and he wasn't as big a fan of her. He didn't like her or the relationship with her sister, and this is what happened. Quote,
"You are not welcome here. Take your dragon with you and your friends and my little brother, who would surely piss his breeches if he were made to stay, but do not presume to take my sister. She will remain here, and she will be wed to a man of my choosing."
Franklin Farman did not lack for courage, as Maester Smike wrote in a letter to the Citadel. He did lack for sense, however, and in that moment, he did not seem to realize how close he stood to death. "I could see the fire in her eyes," the Maester said, "and for a moment I could see Fair Castle burning, the white towers blackening and collapsing into the sea as flames leapt from every window and the dragon wheeled about again and again."
The new Lord Farman didn't know the lessons that apparently this Maester Smike did. Smike, by the way. What kind of name is that? But Rhaena did leave in peace. She didn't reduce Fair Castle to a blackened, collapsed heap. But this is exactly the fear that was inspired by Aegon and Maegor and others that causes people to think twice when they're dealing with the dragon rider. Even when the dragon is outside and the woman is there kind of by herself, and what's she going to do? Yell for the dragon? It doesn't quite work that way. There's some connection between the dragon and dragon rider. The bond is a discussion for another day, but it just goes to show, like, you're afraid of that person. It makes sense. This guy is is described as being foolish for pushing her like that, even though he didn't go too far. She didn't burn his castle. He said what he said, which maybe he should have been more diplomatic about it, but she didn't, kill him. But
it might have been a coin toss, though.
It might have been closer than he thought. Yeah, the Maester seems to think that it was a close run thing. Maybe not, but that's the point, right? That goes to show you don't want to test them. You don't want to get right up to that line. You want to get nowhere near that line. Like, whoo, she almost burned the whole castle. You don't even get close to that. You want to be like, no, she never even considered burning our castle down. That means we did it right. While speaking of Rhaena, we should mention that she spent time with the Lannisters, who tried to get eggs from her. They wanted eggs to make themselves the new Valyria or something like that. Will there be multiple Dragon Rider families in Westeros? Will these powerful families have dragons of their own? Those who cannot control the power of dragons fear it. Those who can control it lust for it. And that's the difference here, because at Fair Isle, they were scared of Dreamfire hatching eggs. They were like, oh no, she'll hatch eggs and there'll be dragons everywhere and they'll be eating our castles and killing our people and stealing our sheep and our women and our children. The Lannisters are like, that's for us. We want to take that. So it's night and day. One is afraid of it. The other one's to control it. Had this happened, had the Lannisters gotten eggs and hatched them and learned to ride dragons, that might have caused war. Jaehaerys, as gentle as he was absolutely willing to go to the mat, was actually willing to go to war over another family getting dragon eggs. He might have unleashed Vermithor on Casterly Rock, which would have been something, because Visenya was even like, I don't want that. That looks tough. When Alyssa Farman, we're still on Farman's here, stole 3 dragon eggs, Jaehaerys declared, we'll have to go out and kill any hatchlings born anywhere in the world. Doesn't matter where they're born, doesn't matter who has them, doesn't matter what political fallout it causes, doesn't matter who we have to burn. We are not allowing a new Valyria to rise. He said, quote, I will not allow Valyria to rise again. Imagine what the Triarchs of Volantis would do with dragons. He's not wrong. It's a tough question. It's like, do you have the right to police the world like that? It's almost irrelevant whether he does or not. He's gonna do it. He might say, I don't, but I'm gonna. Like, I shouldn't have that right, but I'm not gonna allow that to happen to the world again, which is kind of like, it's kind of honorable. He's like, yeah, my ancestors were horrible. Look what they did with draconic power around the world. I'm going to be a decent king. Maybe because he's the guy, kind of the guy you're talking about, Sean. Like, this is when you have a decent guy that's not going to overwhelm people, not shove it in people's faces, not go off conquering, not burn people to death unless he absolutely has to.
But he can't trust anyone else to be that way.
Right. And he knows the world is an evil place. Yeah. He knows the world is an evil place full of violent, ambitious people that if they got their hands on... Just like there's certain people in this world, if they got nuclear power, it would be horrible. And there's a lot of CIAs and KGBs and Mossads and agencies all around the world that are exactly trying to stop nukes from falling into those hands. And it's a different thing as this, because this is like a frontal assault. Like, we will take our dragons and bomb anyone who has that. It's not... We won't assassinate them, because they got to kill the dragon, too. They got to kill the hatchling. It's kind of similar to the slavers, right? The slavers that Dany tricked into thinking she was going to sell an egg. Of course she wasn't going to do that. They should have realized it was a trick, but they were too blind to their ambition, too blind to their lust, too blind to thousands of years of being subjugated by their ancestors, being subjugated by these very beasts. Barristan knew the lesson. He was like, don't do that. This is the one thing that makes you powerful. He just wasn't thinking on Dany's level. He should have figured out that it was like, you just didn't give her enough credit. It's like, she's a 13-year-old girl. She's not pulling off some grand scheme here. Yeah, she is. Yeah, she is. That's exactly what she's doing. So, yeah, let's just wrap this up real quick. We've got only a few more points here, and it's gone a little long, but we'll talk real quickly about Jaehaerys and Viserys a bit more and say that and leave it there. So Jaehaerys was probably mastered this better than anyone, even better than Aegon, the implied threat. He didn't have to rub it in your face, shows you respect, doesn't take it to the point of humiliation. You're intimidated, you're not humiliated. It's a fine line. Maegor was intimidating to the point of humiliation, to the point of just overbearing. Aenys was weak. Aegon was the conqueror, so it's just different with him. He was the guy that started it all. He's just in a different category. Jaehaerys found that fine line. His wife, Shirley, was a big part of that, because she was great at conciliation. You know, he got the title, but she was clearly really good at it too. And on that, he did a good job, but the dragon population just exploded under him, and that might have been a bad idea. Maybe the Targaryens of Dragonstone might have had the right idea, keeping the dragon population small, but it's hard to tell your kids you can't have dragons, right? You buy your eldest kid a car and you don't buy your smallest kid a car? Like, what is that, right? Obviously, it's not the right analogy.
What I say, not what I do, yeah.
But also, the upkeep thing's no longer an issue. Like, they now are established. They can have the money isn't a problem. So, I don't know. Maybe this is when they just lost sight of some of the important things. They thought, oh, this is a different thing. This isn't Valyria. We have a throne. Everything's different. That might have been a naive thinking. Dragon Pit is built. They might have thought they had things more under control. It might have looked good. Jaehaerys had, and that's the message I started this episode with. Peace occasionally breeds complacency, and you forget why peace is worth fighting for in the first place. And as solid as Jaehaerys was, Viserys was pretty lazy, pretty lax, allowed a lot of these conditions to... He didn't create them, but he allowed them to foment and get worse. And, yeah, there's a few other examples that happened during Jaehaerys' reign. There was a couple times where... You remember the example of Prince Morion, where he tried to get a fleet and invade the Stormlands, and he was loud about it, and then Jaehaerys just took... who was it? Aemon and Balon, and they burned those ships. And that's essentially where some of those dragons got their first battle experience. That was Vermithor's first time in war, as well as Caraxes and not Vhagar. Vhagar had been to war before, but good to keep fresh. And of course, during Viserys' reign, there were those wars in the Stepstones. Those were a constant thing, but those were not really as an example of where the people of Westeros didn't feel the pinch. You know, like it was a war in another theater. It wasn't on the mainland. The dragons were very effective versus ships, but they weren't as effective in the island-to-island combat where there are caves to hide in. Now, this is something we want to go into detail in our Stepstones episode. And rather than describe it again, here's a great quote from Prince Daemon himself. Quote,
"In the Stepstones, my enemies learned to run and hide when they saw Caraxes' wings or heard his roar. But they had no dragons of their own. It is no easy thing for a man to be a dragon slayer. But dragons can kill dragons, and have. Any maester who has ever studied the history of Valyria can tell you that. I will not throw our dragons against the usurpers unless I have no other choice. There are other ways to use them, better ways."
The problem is, both sides have to understand that. Daemon understands this. He's a man who has read his history. He's fought on Dragonback before. He has these concepts down. But the Greens don't have that. They don't know that you shouldn't do this. They don't have this level of knowledge. They don't. All the Dragon Riders on that side are young, inexperienced, cocky, if not arrogant, if not a little borderline psycho, maybe in Aemon's case.
He's the one that maybe should have had some experience to realize what was about to happen here.
It might be, Aemon might be the one who most needed to learn a few lessons. Don't use dragon versus dragon unless you must. And he might be the one to be like, yeah, but I have the big dragon. I'm the exception. I can do this because I've got the huge size advantage. He's wrong. It's not quite that simple. It is, if he's in Arax's case, it looked like it was true, but it might not always go that way, and not all dragons are that small. There's dragons that are pretty darn big, not as big as Vhagar, but Vermithor is huge. Caraxes is of great size. Meleys is really, really big. Yeah, it wouldn't go quite so simply, potentially, if that happens. So yeah, what happens when the other side doesn't share that restraint? If you have two nuclear states facing each other, one of them knows it's a last resort. What if the other one doesn't? Then you're both going to start nuking each other. It's like, well, there they go. They launched nukes at us. Well, we have to respond in kind. That's it. They don't have that sense to not do it in the first place. This behavior was lost in old Valyria because it died out. The people that were foolish enough to do it didn't survive. That's why it's like great to describe as an evolutionary trait. Like in the real world, in the real life, creatures that don't evolve die out. You have to keep up. Doing something that self-destructive.
Unless you're a shark.
Unless you're a shark. Sharks don't die out. They just keep on swimming. Sharks don't attack other sharks unless they have a huge size advantage. They figured that out too. So it works as a genetic trait that was bred out of former Valyrian dragon lords. Don't be the guy that attacks other dragons with your dragon. Don't do that. But this era, that lost trait has resurfaced, and the blacks and greens are going to behave stupidly. So the dragons, during the time of Jaehaerys and Viserys, for the most part, didn't engage in war. We saw how that only happened one time at all through the history of Westeros before the Dance of the Dragons, at least during the time of the Targaryens. Who knows what happened, 10,000 years ago, because apparently there were a few dragons in Westeros back then as well. Whether they were even ridden or fought each other is anyone's guess, but we always have a few caveats for truly ancient times. Anyway, the Targaryens lost sight of the costs, the dangers, and the reasons to avoid it in the first place. Yes, a few of them remembered, but not enough of it. It was no longer collective knowledge. It was no longer a deeply held belief by the majority, if not all of them. It's fun for us to go into depth on what the dragons are capable of, but when you lay it out, you see how much destruction they're capable of, how much devastation they're capable of, not just to everyone else, but to each other. It shows one of the central themes of A Song of Ice and Fire, that power corrupts here. It's throwing off common sense even. Like, it's dumb to do the things that they're doing or about to do. And they're not dumb people, right? They aren't unintelligent. They're not Well, some of them are a little bit psycho, but they're not stupid psycho in that sense. You know, it's this mix of ambition, fear, pride, and not listening. Arrogance, yeah, that's a big one, right? And not listening to those who came before, which is part of the arrogance. Not listening to the lessons learned by people that you could learn something from because they are doing the same things you did. Learn from them. Of course, we at History of Westeros, as I said at the beginning, love to emphasize learning from the past or the lessons that come from failing to learn. That's our episode today, folks. Let's do our outro spiel here. That was pretty fun,
I
huh,
want to say
Sean?
real quick, that quote by Daemon, it irked me. I read that, like, yeah, wait, who said that? Oh.
Daemon? Yeah. Of all people, like, yeah, why doesn't he needs to spread that advice to his nephews before that or whatever. It's too late for this message now. Because remember, he's responding to Lord Celtigar, who says, why is this even a conversation? You have more dragons than them. Go to King's Landing, burn it, we win. That's book and show. That's not even much of a divergence. It's pretty much the same language. And Daemon's like, well, in addition to us not wanting to burn the capital, we want to hold the capital and rule from it. We also would probably just result in the death of most of the dragons involved, and that's also bad for us keeping power afterwards. Neither of those things are meet our goals.
That's a level of like wisdom and restraint there that he doesn't typically seem to demonstrate.
Yeah. Okay, folks. The trivia question was: the largest army ever assembled was at the Field of Fire, 55,000 men. What is the largest? That's Westeros. What's the largest army ever assembled in Essos? Prince Garen the Great's army of 250,000 that not only defeated some dragons, but some war elephants and plenty of other things.
It's the biggest army we know of in Planetos, right?
Yeah, it would have to be. Yeah, there certainly isn't a bigger one in Satorios or like the Summer Isles or anything, you know?
We know of anyway.
That we know of, exactly. Episodes that relate to this one, if you want more about the Rhoynar and the fall of the Rhoynish cities and Garen the Great and Grayscale and all that, Mother Rhoyne is the episode for you. More about Dragonstone and the landing of the Targaryens in that era and the secrets of that castle are in the Dragonstone episode. I've even got a Dragonstone shirt on. We have several episodes on Valyrian Wars and the Valyrian Freehold and the Doom of Valyria. Some of those came during Valar Rereadus for Fire and Blood. Some of those came scripted elsewhere. We got a Century of Blood episode. We have a lot of Rereadus content on Aegon's Conquest, which was fairly recent. A lot of that was earlier this year and late last year. And we have several episodes on the Free Cities, individual ones. We got one on Lorath. We have one on Qohor. We have one on Pentos. Yeah, we got some good ones. Hope you all check those out if you haven't already, or maybe it's time for a re-listen. Thanks again to Nina for her valuable assistance, frequent notes and thoughts, and helping me work through some difficult parts of the episode. Check her out at goodqueenally.tumblr.com. Also, thanks to Joey, Jesse, and Bran for the music. We're getting ready to reissue Bran's intro for Fire and Blood for House of the Dragon, rather, and it's awesome. It's an upgraded version. His first one was so good. This one's even cooler. Thanks as well to Michael Klarfeld for the regular video intro that we use on most of our episodes. The maps you see behind us, go to KLARADOX.de to buy maps for yourself, or just buy copies of them, have them printed out yourself at a printing store. And folks, no live streams for the next 2 weeks. We're going to have the Condal interview will be posted, and we will have some one or two older episodes that we'll bring back to the front, and then it's House of the Dragon season time. So folks, we're getting into the fun stuff, and we are looking forward to experiencing that all with you. You know what to do in the meantime. Valar, reread us.
Yeah.